In the blood-soaked halls of Norse mythology, where gods feast on the flesh of their enemies and drink mead from the skulls of the fallen, one name echoes through the 9 realms, with both reverence and horror: Mimir, the smartest man alive, the keeper of all wisdom, the betrayer of the All-Father himself. High above the well of knowledge, suspended from the gnarled branches of Yggdrasil, by chains forged in divine fury, hangs a severed head. Its eyes still burn with the fire of cosmic understanding. Its mouth still speaks truths that could shatter the foundations of Asgard itself. This is not merely the remnant of a man. This is the living proof that even the wisest among the gods can fall victim to their own brilliance. For 1,000 years, Mimir served as Odin's most trusted advisor, the All-Father's right hand in conquest, his voice of reason in war, his guide through the labyrinthine politics of divine power. Every strategy that expanded Asgard's dominion, every diplomatic triumph that bent other realms to Odin's will, every secret that gave the Æsir their crushing advantage over their enemies, bore the mark of Mimir's incomparable intellect. He was the architect of an empire built on the bones of countless civilizations, the mastermind behind victories so complete that entire species were erased from existence. But wisdom, true wisdom, comes with a terrible price. The more Mimir learned about the 9 realms, the more he understood about Odin's methods, the more he witnessed the suffering caused by divine ambition, the deeper grew a cancer in his soul. Knowledge without conscience is the tool of tyrants. Understanding without compassion is the weapon of monsters. And slowly, inevitably, the smartest man alive began to see his beloved All-Father for what he truly was. The betrayal that followed would shake the very roots of Yggdrasil itself. It would turn the most loyal servant into the most dangerous enemy. It would transform the keeper of wisdom into the prophet of Odin's doom. But the price of conscience is always paid in blood, and Mimir's blood would flow for centuries as payment for his sins against the crown. Picture this moment of ultimate reckoning. Odin, the All-Father, master of war and wisdom, standing before his most trusted advisor with rage burning in his single eye like the fires of Muspelheim itself. Gungnir, the spear that never misses, trembling in his grip as the full scope of Mimir's treachery unfolds before him like a map to his own destruction. And Mimir, bound in chains of his own making, his vast intelligence finally turned against the throne he helped build, speaking words that would condemn him to an eternity of torment, but save the 9 realms from endless tyranny. The ancient texts, written in giant blood on tablets of world tree bark, speak of this confrontation in whispers. They tell us that when Odin discovered the depth of Mimir's betrayal, his roar of fury shattered every window in Gladsheim. They say that Valhalla itself trembled as the All-Father realized that his closest friend, his wisest counselor, his most valuable ally, had been working against him for decades. But what the texts don't reveal, what even the most learned scholars of divine lore have never understood, is the true scope of what Mimir had done. This was no simple act of rebellion. This was no momentary lapse in judgment, brought on by guilt or madness. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign of sabotage that spanned centuries, a web of deception so intricate that it makes Loki's schemes look like the pranks of a child. Mimir had been systematically undermining Odin's power from within, using his position as the All-Father's most trusted advisor to protect Odin's enemies, preserve the knowledge Odin sought to destroy, and prepare the way for the very prophecy Odin feared most. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the end of everything Odin had built, and Mimir, the smartest man alive, had been its secret architect all along. But here is where the true horror begins, where the tale takes a turn so twisted that even the Norns themselves weep when they spin this thread of fate. For Odin's punishment of his betrayer was not death. Death would have been mercy. Death would have been release. Instead, The All-Father devised a torment so exquisite, so perfectly calibrated to Mimir's nature, that it would serve as both revenge and insurance policy for all eternity. The severed head that now hangs from Yggdrasil's branches was not killed. It was preserved, enhanced, made immortal in its suffering, so that Odin could continue to extract every secret, every piece of hidden knowledge, every fragment of wisdom that had made Mimir so dangerous. The torture would continue forever, but so would the usefulness. The betrayer would spend eternity paying for his crimes while still serving his master's will. At least, that was Odin's plan. What the All-Father could never have predicted, what his own paranoia and thirst for control blinded him to, was that some betrayals run so deep, some acts of conscience burn so bright, that not even the torments of eternal damnation can extinguish them. The head that hangs from the world tree today still burns with the fire of rebellion. The voice that once counseled the All-Father in conquest now whispers secrets of his downfall. The wisdom that built an empire now works tirelessly for its destruction. And when a certain ghost of Sparta arrives in Midgard, carrying with him the power to kill gods and the will to challenge fate itself, Mimir's long wait for vengeance will finally come to an end. But that tale of liberation and redemption lies ahead of us, beyond mountains of suffering and oceans of divine blood. First, we must understand how the smartest man alive became the most betrayed soul in all the 9 realms. Before the 9 realms knew order, before the world tree stretched its branches across the cosmos, before the first god drew breath, or the first giant walked the earth, there existed only the void, Ginnungagap, the yawning emptiness, where primordial forces swirled in eternal chaos, waiting for the spark of creation to give them form and purpose. And from this primal darkness, when the fires of Muspelheim first met the ice of Niflheim, came beings of such ancient power that their names are spoken only in whispers by those who still remember the old ways. Mimir was born in this time before time, when wisdom itself was a raw force of nature, untamed and unbound by the laws that would later govern divine society. He emerged not from the union of gods or the crafting of cosmic smiths, but from the very essence of knowledge seeking form, understanding demanding consciousness, truth requiring a voice to speak it into existence. His birth was not a moment, but an eon, not an event, but an evolution of cosmic awareness, becoming self-aware. In those primordial days, Mimir wandered the forming cosmos as a being of pure intellect, witnessing the birth of the first flames, the crystallization of the first ice, the emergence of the first life from the marriage of opposing forces. He saw Ymir, the primordial giant, rise from the melting ice and give birth to the race that would populate the forming worlds. He watched Audhumla, the primeval cow, lick Buri free from the salty ice blocks, beginning the lineage that would eventually produce the gods themselves. He was there when the first roots of Yggdrasil pushed through the fabric of reality, anchoring the cosmos and providing the framework upon which all the realms would hang. But unlike the other primordial beings who were defined by their elemental nature, by fire, or ice, or earth, or sea, Mimir was defined by something far more dangerous: curiosity, an infinite, insatiable hunger for knowledge that drove him to seek out every secret of creation, to understand every mystery of existence, to catalog every truth that the forming universe had to offer. This hunger would prove to be both his greatest strength and his ultimate doom. As the cosmic forces settled into the patterns that would become natural law, as the primordial chaos gave way to divine order, Mimir found himself drawn to a particular wellspring that had formed at the base of Yggdrasil's massive trunk, the Well of Urd, where the Norns would eventually make their home, spinning the threads of fate for every living being. But this was not yet the Well of Fate. In these early days, it was something far more primal, a pool of liquid knowledge, where every truth that had ever been, or ever could be, swirled in eternal motion, waiting for someone wise enough to drink from its depths and strong enough to survive the experience. Most beings who approached the well were driven mad by the sheer scope of what it contained. The knowledge of every possible future, every potential past, every alternate reality that might have been or could still be. The weight of infinite understanding pressed down on mortal minds like a mountain of pure thought, crushing sanity beneath its immeasurable bulk. But Mimir was different. He had been born from the very essence of wisdom itself. His mind was not merely capable of containing cosmic knowledge. It was designed for that purpose. He was, in every sense, the universe's attempt to understand itself. When Mimir first drank from the well, the experience was not the gentle sip of a mortal seeking wisdom, but the desperate gulp of a man dying of thirst in an infinite desert. He consumed knowledge like a starving beast consumes flesh, gorging himself on truth until his very being was saturated with understanding. He learned the secret names of every star that would ever burn, the hidden purposes of every realm that would ever exist, the true nature of every god that would ever be born. He saw the rise and fall of empires that had not yet been dreamed of, the births and deaths of heroes whose legends were still waiting to be written. And in those swirling depths of cosmic knowledge, he saw something that filled even his primordial heart with dread. He saw the end of everything. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle that would consume the 9 realms in flames and wash them away in floods of divine blood. He saw the role he would play in those events, the choices he would make, the prices he would pay. He saw his own betrayal, his own torture, his own redemption played out across the infinite possibilities of fate like a cosmic drama written in the stars themselves. But perhaps most terrifying of all, he saw that these events were not merely possible futures, they were necessary futures. The death of the gods was not a tragedy to be prevented, but a cosmic recycling to be embraced. The old order, built on conquest and control, would have to fall so that something new and better could take its place. The cycle of destruction and rebirth was not a flaw in the design of existence. It was the very engine that drove existence forward into new possibilities. This knowledge would have driven any other being to despair or madness. The understanding that everything you would build, everyone you would love, every victory you would achieve, was ultimately doomed to failure and destruction should have been enough to break even the strongest spirit. But Mimir was not built for despair. He was built for understanding, and with understanding came acceptance, and with acceptance came purpose. If the end was inevitable, then his role was not to prevent it, but to ensure it happened in the way that would cause the least suffering and produce the best possible outcome. If the gods must fall, then he would help them fall in a manner that preserved what was worth preserving and destroyed only what needed to be destroyed. If Ragnarok must come, then he would help guide it toward renewal rather than mere annihilation. This realization transformed Mimir from a being of pure knowledge into something far more dangerous, a being of applied wisdom. Knowledge without purpose is merely trivia. Wisdom without application is merely philosophy. But knowledge and wisdom combined with purpose and will, that becomes the power to reshape the very foundations of reality itself. As the primordial age came to an end, and the age of the gods began, Mimir made a choice that would echo through all of history. He would not remain aloof from the affairs of the emerging divine order. He would not retreat to some distant realm to contemplate cosmic mysteries in isolation. Instead, he would enter the world of politics and power, of alliance and betrayal, of war and conquest. He would become advisor to the greatest of the gods, confidant to the most powerful rulers, keeper of the most dangerous secrets. He would place himself at the very heart of the divine order that he knew was doomed to fall. And from that position, he would work to ensure that when the end came, it would come with wisdom rather than mere destruction. He would become the cancer in the heart of divinity itself, but a cancer with a purpose, a betrayer who betrayed for the sake of a greater truth. The other primordial beings, those few that still existed in forms capable of communication, thought he had gone mad. They believed that the knowledge he had gained from the well had finally broken his mind, that he was deluding himself with fantasies of controlling cosmic fate. But Mimir knew something they did not. He knew that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in avoiding difficult truths, but in embracing them. Sometimes the highest loyalty is found in the deepest betrayal. Sometimes the only way to save something you love is to help destroy it so that it can be reborn in a better form. And so, as Odin began his rise to power, as the Æsir started their conquest of the 9 realms, as the divine order that would rule for millennia began to take shape, Mimir stepped out of the shadows of primordial wisdom and offered his services to the man who would become the All-Father. But even as he swore his oaths of loyalty, even as he began the work that would make him the most trusted advisor in Asgard, the seeds of ultimate betrayal were already planted deep in his ancient heart. The smartest man alive was about to begin the longest, most complex, most devastating game of cosmic chess ever played, and the stakes were nothing less than the fate of all existence. The halls of nascent Asgard echoed with the footsteps of ambition when Odin first laid eyes upon the being who would become both his greatest asset and his ultimate downfall. Fresh from his victory over his father Bor's killers, the young All-Father stood at the threshold of divine supremacy, yet he possessed the wisdom to recognize what he lacked. Raw power could conquer realms, but sustaining an empire required something far more sophisticated: intelligence, strategy, the kind of cosmic understanding that could navigate the treacherous waters of inter-realm politics without drowning in the blood of unnecessary wars. Mimir arrived at Asgard's gates, not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as an equal offering partnership. His reputation had preceded him across the forming 9 realms. Whispers spoke of a being whose knowledge encompassed the secret paths between worlds, who understood the ancient laws that governed divine interaction, who could speak the languages of giants and dwarfs with equal fluency. More importantly, he possessed something that Odin desperately needed but could never openly admit to lacking: perspective beyond the narrow focus of Æsir ambition. The first meeting between the future All-Father and the smartest man alive took place in what would later become the Great Hall Gladsheim, though at that time it was little more than a crude wooden structure built from the bones of Ymir and roofed with his skull. Odin, still bearing the scars of recent battles, his ravens Hugin and Munin, barely fledglings perched on his shoulders, faced a being whose ancient eyes held depths of knowledge that made even the young god feel like a child grasping at adult concepts. Mimir's offer was elegantly simple. He would serve as advisor, providing the wisdom necessary to transform the Æsir from successful raiders into the rulers of a stable divine order. In exchange, he asked for nothing more than access to Asgard's growing libraries and the freedom to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead. No treasures, no titles, no formal position in the divine hierarchy. Just the opportunity to observe and learn from the greatest political experiment in cosmic history. What Odin heard was an offer too good to refuse. What he failed to understand was that he was not hiring an advisor so much as welcoming a scholar whose true interest lay in studying the rise and inevitable fall of divine civilizations. Mimir had witnessed the birth and death of primordial powers. He understood that all empires, even those built by gods, contained within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. His role would be to nurture those seeds while appearing to serve the empire's growth. The early years of their partnership bore fruit beyond Odin's wildest expectations. Mimir's counsel proved invaluable in the complex negotiations that established Asgard's dominance over Alfheim, securing the loyalty of the Light Elves through a combination of mutual benefit and subtle intimidation. His deep understanding of dwarf psychology enabled the Æsir to forge the weapons and tools that would become legendary symbols of their power. Most importantly, his knowledge of giant culture and customs allowed Odin to exploit the divisions within Jotunheim, playing different factions against each other while appearing to remain neutral. Under Mimir's guidance, Odin learned to wield diplomacy as effectively as he wielded Gungnir. The young god discovered that a well-timed concession could be more valuable than a military victory, that appearing to compromise while actually gaining ground required a sophistication of thought that pure warrior culture could never provide. Mimir taught him to think in terms of decades rather than seasons, to plan campaigns that would unfold across generations rather than single battles. But perhaps most crucially, Mimir began to shape Odin's understanding of knowledge itself. As the ultimate source of power, it was Mimir who first suggested that information could be more valuable than gold, that secrets hoarded properly could provide leverage over even the mightiest enemies. He introduced Odin to the concept of intelligence networks, showing him how carefully placed agents could provide warnings of rebellion before the first sword was drawn, how understanding an enemy's deepest fears and desires could turn potential foes into unwilling allies. The transformation of Odin, from warrior chief to cosmic emperor, was Mimir's first great masterpiece of manipulation. Every suggestion appeared to serve Asgard's interests. Every piece of advice seemed designed to strengthen Odin's position and extend Æsir influence. Yet beneath the surface of apparent loyalty, Mimir was already beginning the slow, patient work that would ultimately topple everything they built together. The genius of Mimir's approach lay in its subtlety. He never counseled Odin toward obviously destructive actions. Instead, he guided the All-Father toward decisions that would provide short-term benefits while creating long-term vulnerabilities. He encouraged Odin's natural paranoia by presenting it as justified caution. He fed the god's hunger for knowledge by framing it as necessary preparation for future threats. Most dangerously, he began to nurture Odin's growing obsession with preventing his own prophesied doom. It was Mimir who first brought news of the prophecies surrounding Ragnarok to Odin's attention. Not directly, of course. That would have been far too crude. Instead, he allowed fragments of information to reach the All-Father through seemingly independent sources. A captured giant's dying curse, a cryptic verse discovered in an ancient text, a disturbing dream reported by one of the Æsir. Each piece of the puzzle arrived separately, forcing Odin to assemble the picture himself, and thus making him believe the discovery was his own. The moment Odin first understood the true scope of the prophecies surrounding his eventual death, Mimir achieved his first great victory in the cosmic game he was playing. The All-Father's reaction was exactly what the ancient being had anticipated. Rather than accepting fate with dignity or working to ensure a worthy legacy, Odin became consumed with the need to prevent the prophecies from coming true. This obsession would drive him to increasingly desperate measures, each one creating new opportunities for Mimir to guide Asgard toward its destined fall. As Odin's trusted advisor, Mimir found himself privy to conversations and decisions that shaped the fate of entire realms. He witnessed the planning sessions where the systematic conquest of the 9 realms was mapped out in detail. He observed the debates where the Æsir decided which civilizations deserved to survive and which should be eliminated entirely. Most importantly, he gained access to the network of spies, informants, and agents that Odin was building across all the worlds. This intelligence network, created ostensibly to serve Asgard's interests, became Mimir's primary tool for undermining those same interests. Every agent recruited to spy for Odin was also a potential double agent who could be turned to serve a higher purpose. Every piece of information gathered to strengthen Asgard's position could also be used to protect Asgard's enemies. The very system designed to preserve divine rule became the mechanism for its eventual destruction. Mimir's ascension to the position of Odin's most trusted advisor was not achieved through deception or manipulation alone. His counsel genuinely proved valuable time and again. His strategies genuinely secured victories for the Æsir. His intelligence genuinely protected Asgard from numerous threats. This success was crucial to his long-term plans because it established his credibility beyond question. When Mimir spoke, gods listened. When he offered advice, it was accepted without hesitation. When he requested access to sensitive information or permission to pursue dangerous knowledge, his proven track record of success made such requests seem not only reasonable but necessary. The irony was delicious in its completeness. The more successful Mimir became at serving Odin's apparent interests, the more power he gained to subvert those interests in service of a greater purpose. Every victory he secured for Asgard increased his influence within the divine hierarchy. Every threat he helped neutralize enhanced his reputation for wisdom and foresight. Every secret he uncovered in service of the All-Father became another tool he could eventually use to bring about the All-Father's downfall. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Mimir's position evolved from trusted advisor to indispensable confidant. There were no major decisions made in Asgard without his input, no significant policies implemented without his blessing, no important secrets kept from his knowledge. He became, in every meaningful sense, the true power behind the throne of the Nine Realms. Odin might wear the crown and wield the spear, but Mimir held the keys to the vast machinery of divine government. And throughout this entire ascension, not once did Odin suspect that his most loyal servant was also his most dangerous enemy. Not once did it occur to the All-Father that the being who had helped him achieve cosmic dominance was the same being who would orchestrate his cosmic destruction. The smartest man alive had played his role to perfection, gaining access to everything he needed to fulfill his ancient purpose while appearing to be nothing more than a devoted counselor serving his divine master's will. But cosmic games played on such a scale require patience that spans millennia. Mimir's true work was only just beginning. The foundation had been laid, the trust established, the access secured. Now came the delicate task of using that position to guide events toward their inevitable conclusion, all while maintaining the perfect facade of unwavering loyalty to the very God whose doom he was secretly orchestrating. The scent of divine ichor still lingered in the air when Mimir first witnessed the true extent of Odin's capacity for brutality. What had begun as a diplomatic mission to resolve territorial disputes between the Æsir and Vanir had devolved into something far more sinister, and the smartest man alive found himself standing in a field strewn with the bodies of gods who had trusted in the sanctity of parley. The Æsir-Vanir War, as history would remember it, was not supposed to happen. Both pantheons had agreed to peaceful negotiations, recognizing that divine civil war served no one's interests except their mutual enemies. Mimir had spent months crafting the terms of discussion, establishing protocols that would allow both sides to maintain their honor while finding common ground. His carefully constructed diplomatic framework should have prevented bloodshed entirely. Instead, he watched Odin's warriors butcher an entire delegation of Vanir gods who had come to Asgard under promises of safe passage. The All-Father's justification was as cold as it was calculated. Intelligence had suggested that the Vanir were planning treachery, that their peaceful overtures masked preparations for a surprise attack. Better to strike first and deal with the diplomatic consequences later than to risk being caught unprepared by divine enemies. Mimir knew the intelligence was fabricated. He had crafted it himself, feeding carefully constructed lies through channels that would make them appear authentic to Odin's other advisors. The Vanir had never planned any attack. They had come to Asgard, genuinely seeking peace, hoping to avoid the very war that their murders now made inevitable. But Mimir needed that war to happen. He needed Odin to take the first steps down the path that would ultimately lead to his own destruction. The massacre of the Vanir peace delegation was executed with methodical precision. Odin's warriors surrounded the visiting gods during what was supposed to be a ceremonial feast, trapping them in Gladsheim, with no possibility of escape or defense. The Vanir, having come in peace, carried no weapons and wore no armor. They died like sheep in a slaughterhouse, their divine blood soaking into the wooden floors of Asgard's great hall. Mimir stood among Odin's other advisors, watching the carnage unfold with an expression of carefully crafted shock and dismay. He played his role perfectly, appearing to be as horrified by the violence as any civilized being should be, while inwardly marking another successful manipulation in his cosmic game. Every drop of Vanir blood spilled that night served his ultimate purpose, even as it stained his own conscience with the weight of necessary evil. The aftermath was everything Mimir had hoped for and more. The surviving Vanir, led by Njörður and his children Freyr and Freya, declared eternal war against the Æsir. What followed was not the swift conquest that Odin had anticipated, but a grinding conflict that would span decades and cost both pantheons dearly in blood and treasure. More importantly for Mimir's purposes, the war would force Odin to make increasingly desperate choices that would alienate potential allies and create new enemies across the 9 realms. Mimir's role during the conflict was that of strategic advisor and intelligence coordinator. He helped plan campaigns that appeared brilliant in their conception, but contained subtle flaws that prevented complete victory. He organized spy networks that provided valuable information while also ensuring that crucial intelligence occasionally found its way to Vanir forces. Most importantly, he helped coordinate diplomatic efforts with other realms that ostensibly sought support for the Æsir cause, while actually laying the groundwork for future rebellions. The war's first major battle took place in the contested realm of Vanaheim, where both pantheons claimed ancient rights of dominion. Mimir accompanied Odin's forces as they marched through the Bifrost, witnessing firsthand the All-Father's evolution from cautious ruler to ruthless warlord. The transformation was both fascinating and horrifying to observe. The young god who had once listened carefully to counsel about restraint and wisdom was rapidly becoming a being who viewed every problem as a nail requiring the hammer of overwhelming force. The Battle of the Golden Plains, where Æsir warriors first met Vanir forces in open combat, revealed the true nature of divine warfare to those who had never witnessed gods trying to kill each other with serious intent. The scale of destruction was beyond anything mortal minds could comprehend. Mountains were leveled by misdirected blows from divine weapons. Rivers boiled away under the heat of magical energies unleashed without restraint. Entire forests were reduced to ash in moments as the fundamental forces of creation were weaponized by beings who understood their true power. Mimir watched Thor, still young and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's approval, tear through enemy ranks with Mjolnir singing through the air like a comet of destruction. Each blow from the enchanted hammer sent shockwaves that could be felt across multiple realms. Lightning danced between his fingers as he called down thunderstorms that turned the battlefield into a hellscape of mud and blood and screaming winds. But it was Odin himself who provided the most chilling display of divine power, unleashed without restraint. The All-Father fought not as a warrior seeking honorable victory, but as a force of nature given consciousness and malevolent purpose. Gungnir, the spear that never missed its target, became an extension of his will to dominate and destroy. Reality itself seemed to bend around him as he moved through the battle, space and time distorting to accommodate his presence. The Vanir fought with equal ferocity and skill, but they were hampered by their own nature. Where the Æsir had embraced the brutal pragmatism of total war, the Vanir still clung to concepts of honor and restraint that had no place on a battlefield where gods sought each other's permanent destruction. Njörður's forces fought bravely, but they fought like civilized beings trying to resolve a dispute rather than predators seeking to devour their enemies entirely. Mimir observed every tactical decision, every strategic choice, every moment of hesitation or escalation that shaped the battle's outcome. He noted which Æsir warriors showed signs of enjoying the violence too much, marking them as potential problems for future manipulation. He watched which gods struggled with the moral implications of killing their own kind, identifying them as possible allies in his long-term plans. Most importantly, he studied Odin's reactions to various battle scenarios, learning how the All-Father's mind worked under extreme pressure. The battle ended in tactical victory for the Æsir, but strategic disaster for both sides. The Vanir forces retreated in good order, having inflicted casualties that Asgard could not easily afford. More significantly, the level of destruction caused by the battle had been so extreme that several neutral realms took notice and began to question whether the Æsir could be trusted as neighbors. The diplomatic cost of victory was beginning to outweigh its military benefits. In the aftermath of the battle, as both sides tended their wounds and prepared for the next engagement, Mimir began to implement the next phase of his plan. He started feeding Odin intelligence about supposed Vanir atrocities, carefully crafted reports that painted the enemy Pantheon as monsters who deserved no mercy or consideration. Simultaneously, he ensured that news of actual Æsir atrocities reached the ears of potential allies, gradually isolating Odin's forces from possible sources of support. The war's second phase was characterized by escalating brutality, as both sides abandoned any pretense of restraint. Mimir watched Odin order the execution of Vanir prisoners, breaking ancient divine laws about the treatment of captured enemies. He observed the All-Father's growing paranoia as reports reached Asgard about other realms considering intervention on behalf of the Vanir. Most importantly, he witnessed the moment when Odin first spoke seriously about the possibility of genocide as a viable solution to the Vanir problem. This escalation served Mimir's purposes perfectly. Each atrocity committed by the Æsir under Odin's command created new enemies and alienated potential allies. Each violation of divine law established precedents that would eventually be turned against Asgard itself. Each step down the path of increasingly desperate measures brought the All-Father closer to the kind of moral corruption that would make his eventual downfall seem not just inevitable, but necessary. The turning point came when Vanir forces, driven to desperation by their losses, attempted to assassinate Odin during a supposed peace negotiation. The attack failed, but it provided the All-Father with the justification he had been seeking for truly extreme measures. If the Vanir would not accept Æsir dominance through reasonable conquest, then they would be made to accept it through complete annihilation. Mimir counseled restraint, as his role demanded, but his arguments were carefully crafted to be logical without being compelling. He presented alternatives to genocide that were technically sound but practically impossible to implement given the current circumstances. He raised moral objections that were philosophically correct but emotionally unsatisfying to a god consumed with rage and wounded pride. In short, he played the role of the voice of reason while ensuring that reason would be overruled by passion. The final phase of the Æsir-Vanir War was less a conflict between equals than a systematic campaign of extermination. Odin's forces, now operating under orders to show no mercy and take no prisoners, swept through Vanir territories like a plague of divine locusts, consuming everything in their path. Entire bloodlines were ended, ancient shrines were desecrated, cultural treasures that had taken millennia to create were destroyed in moments of vindictive fury. Mimir accompanied the worst of these campaigns, documenting every atrocity while appearing to serve as a strategic coordinator. He watched cities burn and listened to the screams of divine beings being tortured for information they did not possess. He stood beside Odin as the All-Father ordered the execution of Vanir children who might someday seek vengeance for their parents' deaths. He witnessed the birth of the monster that Odin would become, knowing that he had helped midwife that transformation. The war ended not with a treaty or formal surrender, But with exhaustion, both sides had bled so extensively that continuing the conflict risked leaving them vulnerable to external threats. The surviving Vanir submitted to Æsir rule not out of respect or acknowledgement of defeat, but because they simply lacked the strength to resist further. It was a hollow victory that satisfied no one and solved none of the underlying problems that had caused the conflict. But for Mimir, the war had been a complete success. He had managed to guide Odin through his first major test as a conqueror, helping him achieve tactical victory while ensuring strategic failure. The All-Father was now a proven war criminal, whose methods had alienated potential allies throughout the 9 realms. More importantly, Odin had tasted the intoxicating power of absolute dominance over other divine beings, creating an addiction that would drive him to increasingly extreme measures in future conflicts. The smartest man alive had successfully engineered the corruption of the most powerful god in the Norse pantheon, and he had done it while appearing to be nothing more than a loyal advisor, helping his master achieve victory. The first divine blood had been spilled, but it would not be the last. The pattern had been established, the precedent set, the moral boundaries broken. Everything that followed would be built upon the foundation of brutality and betrayal that Mimir had helped construct in the ashes of the Æsir-Vanir War. In the centuries following the Æsir-Vanir War, Asgard reached heights of power and prosperity that would never again be equaled in the history of the 9 realms. The surviving Vanir gods, led by Njörður, Freyr, and Freya, had been integrated into the Æsir Pantheon through a combination of political marriages, hostage exchanges, and carefully negotiated treaties that gave them status while ensuring their loyalty. To outside observers, this represented the triumph of diplomatic wisdom over the crude brutality of conquest. To Mimir, it represented the next phase in Odin's carefully orchestrated moral destruction. The integration of the Vanir brought new knowledge and capabilities to Asgard's divine hierarchy. Njörður's mastery over seas and winds expanded Æsir influence into maritime realms that had previously remained independent. Freyr's dominion over fertility and prosperity ensured bountiful harvests across territories under Asgard's rule, making Æsir governance genuinely popular among mortal populations who had known only scarcity under their previous rulers. Most significantly, Freyr's expertise in Sæther magic provided the Æsir with mystical capabilities that complemented their existing strengths in warfare and intimidation. Mimir watched these developments with the satisfaction of a master craftsman, seeing his long-term plans take shape perfectly. The Vanir integration was not evidence of Odin's growing wisdom or restraint. It was proof of his increasing sophistication in the art of domination. Rather than ruling through crude force alone, the All-Father was learning to rule through a combination of force, manipulation, and the careful cultivation of dependence. His subjects would love their chains because those chains were forged from gold and decorated with flowers. Under Mimir's continued counsel, Odin established the governmental structures that would define divine rule for the next millennium. The Council of the Æsir was formalized, creating a deliberative body that gave the appearance of shared governance, while ensuring that all real power remained concentrated in the All-Father's hands. Representatives from subject realms were invited to participate in certain discussions, fostering the illusion that their opinions mattered, while providing Odin with intelligence about potential dissent in their home territories. The construction of New Asgard began during this period, transforming the crude wooden halls of Odin's early reign into a city worthy of cosmic emperors. Gladsheim was expanded into a palace complex that could house thousands of gods, Einherjar, and honored guests simultaneously. Valhalla was built as both barracks for the glorious dead and monument to Æsir military supremacy. The Well of Urd was enclosed within a great temple where the Norns could weave fate under divine protection and supervision. Mimir played a crucial role in these construction projects, not as an architect or engineer, but as the coordinator who ensured that every building, every district, Every decorative element served multiple purposes. The grand halls that impressed visitors with their beauty also contained hidden passages for surveillance. The magnificent temples that demonstrated Æsir piety also housed weapons caches and communication centers. The residential quarters that provided comfort for allied gods also included chambers specifically designed for interrogation and imprisonment. Most importantly, Mimir oversaw the creation of Asgard's great library, a repository of knowledge that supposedly contained the accumulated wisdom of all the 9 realms. In reality, it contained carefully edited versions of that knowledge, with dangerous information removed or altered to serve Æsir interests. The true texts, the ones that contained prophecies about Ragnarok and detailed accounts of Odin's various atrocities, were stored in a secret vault beneath the library, where only Mimir had access to them. The establishment of formal diplomatic relations with other pantheons marked another milestone in Asgard's golden age. Odin, guided by Mimir's expertise in inter-realm politics, negotiated treaties with the Egyptian gods, established trade agreements with various Celtic deities, and even opened tentative communications with the mysterious entities that ruled in distant realms beyond the reach of Yggdrasil's branches. These diplomatic triumphs enhanced Asgard's prestige while providing new opportunities for intelligence gathering and influence peddling. Behind the facade of diplomatic success, however, Mimir was carefully sowing the seeds of future conflicts. Every treaty contained clauses that could be interpreted as provocative under the right circumstances. Every trade agreement included terms that would become onerous if economic conditions changed. Every alliance was structured in ways that would create tensions between Asgard's various partners, ensuring that they could never unite effectively against Æsir interests. The cultural flowering that accompanied Asgard's political success was perhaps the most impressive aspect of the Golden Age. Skaldic poetry reached new heights of sophistication as court poets competed to craft verses worthy of the cosmic empire their patrons had built. The arts of warfare evolved from crude brutality into elegant displays of divine skill and power. Even the daily rituals of court life became elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the mythological significance of Æsir rule, while providing endless opportunities for political maneuvering. Mimir cultivated this cultural renaissance with the same careful attention he devoted to military and diplomatic matters. He encouraged the development of art forms that glorified Æsir achievements, while subtly undermining the values that had made those achievements possible. The epic poems that celebrated Odin's victories also contained embedded criticisms of the methods used to achieve them. The heroic songs that praised Æsir warriors also included themes about the tragic costs of endless conflict. The integration of Seidr magic into Æsir culture, facilitated by Freyja's teachings, provided Mimir with new tools for his long-term manipulation campaign. Unlike the more straightforward magic that most gods employed, Seidr involved complex interactions with fate and prophecy that could be guided towards specific outcomes without appearing to violate divine laws about destiny. Mimir studied these techniques intensively, mastering forms of magical influence that would allow him to shape future events while maintaining complete deniability about his involvement. The Golden Age reached its peak during the period historians would later call the Great Expansion, when Æsir influence extended across realms that had never before acknowledged any form of divine authority. Mimir's intelligence networks provided detailed maps of uncharted territories. His diplomatic protocols established frameworks for integrating new subjects into the cosmic empire, and his strategic planning ensured that expansion proceeded at a sustainable pace that would not overextend Asgard's military capabilities. Yet even as he helped orchestrate these triumphs, Mimir was carefully documenting every compromise, every moral shortcut, every expedient decision that made them possible. He maintained detailed records of which gods had accepted bribes, which allies had been coerced into cooperation, which enemies had been neutralized through assassination rather than honest combat. This documentation would eventually provide the evidence needed to justify Asgard's destruction, but for now it served as insurance against potential betrayals within the Pantheon itself. The treatment of conquered populations during this period revealed the sophisticated nature of Asur oppression under Odin's mature rule. Rather than ruling through terror alone, the All-Father had learned to rule through a combination of genuine benefits and subtle threats. Conquered realms received protection from external enemies, assistance with natural disasters, and access to Asgard's advanced magical technologies. In exchange, they provided tribute, military service when required, and absolute loyalty to the cosmic order that Odin represented. This system was far more effective than crude tyranny, but it was also far more morally corrupting for those who administered it. Mimir watched his fellow advisors rationalize increasingly questionable policies by pointing to their beneficial effects on subject populations. He observed Asur gods convincing themselves that their rule was not only legitimate, but actively virtuous, because it provided stability and prosperity to realms that had known only chaos before their conquest. The personal relationships that developed within Asgard's court during the Golden Age were perhaps the most complex aspect of Mimir's manipulation campaign. He cultivated genuine friendships with gods who trusted him completely, knowing that he would eventually betray that trust in service of a greater cause. He provided counsel that genuinely improved their lives and enhanced their effectiveness as rulers, while simultaneously gathering the intelligence that would eventually be used to destroy them. His relationship with Frigg, Odin's queen, was particularly delicate to manage. The All-Mother was intelligent enough to recognize inconsistencies in the information she received, compassionate enough to be disturbed by some of her husband's policies, and powerful enough to potentially interfere with Mimir's plans if she became suspicious. He managed her by presenting himself as a moderating influence on Odin's more extreme tendencies, allowing her to believe that his presence prevented even worse atrocities, while ensuring that she never learned the full extent of what those atrocities actually involved. The birth of Baldr during this period provided Mimir with both his greatest opportunity and his greatest challenge. The young god represented everything that was admirable about divine nature, embodying ideals of justice, wisdom, and compassion that stood in stark contrast to the increasingly pragmatic cynicism of his father's administration. Baldr's very existence served as a living reminder of what the Æsir could have been if they had chosen a different path, making him both an inspiration to those who still believed in noble ideals and a threat to those whose power depended on the abandonment of such ideals. Mimir recognized that Baldr would eventually have to be neutralized if Odin's corruption was to continue unchecked. A god of such obvious virtue could not be allowed to mature into a potential alternative to his father's rule. Yet Baldr was also beloved throughout the 9 realms, and his destruction would have to be accomplished in a way that appeared accidental or inevitable rather than deliberate. The prophecies surrounding Baldr's death provided the perfect framework for such a manipulation, but implementing that framework would require years of careful preparation and perfect timing. The Golden Age of the Gods was in many ways Mimir's greatest masterpiece of long-term manipulation. He had successfully guided Asgard to heights of power and prosperity that made its eventual fall all the more tragic and inevitable. The very achievements that the Æsir celebrated most proudly contained within them the mechanisms of their own destruction. The empire they had built was magnificent, but it was also fundamentally unsustainable because it was built on foundations of violence, deception, and moral compromise that would eventually collapse under their own weight. As the Golden Age reached its zenith, Mimir began to implement the next phase of his cosmic plan. The corruption was complete, the dependencies established, the contradictions embedded in every aspect of Asur rule. Now came the delicate task of engineering the crises that would expose those contradictions and bring about the reckoning that cosmic justice demanded. The smartest man alive had spent centuries building up the divine order he intended to destroy, and the time was approaching when his true work could finally begin in earnest. The expansion of Asgard's intelligence apparatus across the 9 realms represented perhaps the most sophisticated espionage operation ever undertaken by divine beings. What began as a practical necessity for maintaining control over conquered territories evolved into something far more comprehensive and sinister under Mimir's careful guidance. Every realm, every significant population center, every gathering place where potential dissidents might congregate, found itself under surveillance by agents who reported directly to the smartest man alive. Mimir's approach to intelligence gathering differed fundamentally from the crude methods employed by most divine powers. Rather than relying solely on fear and intimidation to compel cooperation, he built networks based on genuine relationships, shared interests, and carefully cultivated dependencies. His agents were not merely spies but trusted members of their communities who provided information not because they were forced to, but because they believed they were serving a greater good. The dwarven realms of Nidavellir proved particularly receptive to Mimir's overtures. The master craftsman who forged weapons and artifacts for gods throughout the 9 realms naturally came into contact with sensitive information about their clients' plans and capabilities. Mimir established relationships with key smiths by providing them with rare materials and advanced techniques, ostensibly to improve the quality of work they produced for Asgard. In reality, these gifts created obligations that could be leveraged for intelligence purposes when needed. Eitri, the dwarf king, who would later forge Thor's hammer Mjolnir, became one of Mimir's most valuable assets during this period. The relationship began innocently enough, with Mimir sharing theoretical knowledge about metallurgy and enchantment that helped Eitri solve complex technical problems. Over time, however, these academic discussions evolved into informal briefings about which gods were commissioning what types of weapons and why they might need them. The genius of this arrangement lay in its mutual benefit. Eitri genuinely appreciated the intellectual stimulation of his conversations with Mimir and valued the practical improvements that resulted from their collaboration. Mimir, meanwhile, gained access to intelligence about the military preparations and political concerns of virtually every significant power in the 9 realms. When war clouds gathered on distant horizons, the first signs often appeared in the workshops of Nidavellir, as nervous gods commissioned new weapons and armor. In Alfheim, Mimir's network operated through different mechanisms entirely. The Light Elves' sophisticated magical traditions made them natural allies for someone interested in advanced applications of mystical knowledge. Mimir positioned himself as a scholar of comparative magic, genuinely contributing to Alfheim's understanding of different approaches to sorcery, while learning about light elf capabilities and internal politics. The relationship with Lajasafgaka, the greatest of the light elf mages, developed over decades of scholarly correspondence and occasional visits. Their discussions ranged across topics that included theoretical applications of light magic, the relationship between illumination and revelation, and the philosophical implications of magic that could literally make truth visible. These conversations provided Mimir with insights into light elf society that proved invaluable when Odin later sought to tighten his control over Alfheim. More significantly, the light elves' natural abilities to perceive hidden truths made them potentially dangerous to anyone operating covert networks across the realms. By establishing himself as a trusted friend and intellectual peer, Mimir ensured that their truth-seeking abilities would be directed toward targets he considered appropriate rather than toward his own activities. The Light Elves became unwitting guardians of his secrets, using their powers to verify the false intelligence he fed them while remaining blind to his true purposes. Jotunheim presented the greatest challenge for Mimir's intelligence operations because the giants were Asgard's primary enemies, and therefore naturally suspicious of any overtures from Æsir-associated individuals. However, this challenge also represented the greatest opportunity, since intelligence about giant activities was more valuable than information from any other source. Mimir's solution was characteristically sophisticated, relying on the giants' own cultural traditions and social structures to create openings for infiltration. Giant society placed enormous value on wisdom and knowledge, particularly the kind of ancient understanding that connected them to the primordial forces of creation. Mimir, with his genuine credentials as a being of cosmic wisdom, found it relatively easy to establish contacts within giant communities by presenting himself as a scholar interested in preserving their cultural heritage. His requests for access to ancient texts and oral traditions were granted readily because they appeared to serve the giants' own interests in maintaining their historical legacy. Through these scholarly contacts, Mimir developed relationships with giants who had no idea they were providing intelligence to their greatest enemy. Utgard Loki, the giant king, who would later challenge Thor to various contests, became a regular correspondent on matters of ancient history and mystical philosophy. Their exchanges provided Mimir with detailed knowledge of giant military capabilities, internal political disputes, and strategic planning that proved invaluable when Odin later launched his campaign of genocide against their people. The moral weight of these relationships was not lost on Mimir. He was genuinely fond of many of the giants he cultivated as intelligence sources, appreciating their wisdom, respecting their cultural achievements, and understanding the justice of their grievances against Æsir rule. Yet he continued to exploit their trust and friendship in service of their ultimate destruction, knowing that their extinction was a necessary component of the cosmic cycle that would eventually lead to rebirth and renewal. The establishment of communication networks linking his agents across the realms required innovations in magical technology that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Traditional methods of long-distance communication were either too slow or too easily intercepted by hostile forces. Mimir developed new techniques based on sympathetic magic and quantum entanglement that allowed near-instantaneous communication across vast distances while remaining virtually undetectable. These communication networks served multiple purposes beyond simple intelligence gathering. They allowed Mimir to coordinate responses to emerging threats, spread disinformation to enemy forces, and manipulate events across multiple realms simultaneously. More importantly, they provided him with the capability to orchestrate complex operations that required precise timing and coordination between agents who might never meet each other face to face. The network's first major test came during a potential rebellion in Vanaheim, where surviving Vanir loyalists were reportedly planning an uprising against Æsir rule. Mimir's agents provided early warning of the plot, detailed intelligence about its participants and objectives, and real-time updates on its progress. This information allowed Odin to crush the rebellion before it could gain momentum, but it also allowed Mimir to ensure that certain key Vanir leaders escaped capture and remained available for future operations. The rebellion's failure served Odin's immediate interests by eliminating a threat to Æsir control, but it also served Mimir's long-term purposes by demonstrating the effectiveness of his intelligence networks and increasing Odin's dependence on the information they provided. The All-Father, impressed by the quality and timeliness of the intelligence that had prevented the uprising, authorized significant expansions to Mimir's operations and granted him even broader access to sensitive information. Cultural infiltration proved as valuable as political intelligence in many contexts. Mimir understood that lasting control over conquered populations required more than military dominance or political submission. It required the gradual erosion of cultural identities that might serve as foundations for resistance movements. His agents worked to promote Æsir values and perspectives, while subtly undermining local traditions and beliefs that might encourage independence. This cultural warfare was conducted with remarkable subtlety. Rather than attempting to destroy local traditions entirely, Mimir's approach involved gradual modification and reinterpretation. Ancient stories were preserved but retold in ways that emphasized the benefits of Æsir rule. Traditional festivals continued but incorporated elements that honored Odin and his pantheon. Local leaders remained in place but found themselves increasingly dependent on Asgard for resources and legitimacy. The long-term effects of these cultural modifications were devastating for the independence movements that might otherwise have challenged Æsir dominance. Populations that had been conquered militarily were gradually conquered spiritually and intellectually as well, losing the cultural foundations that might have supported effective resistance. By the time they realized what was happening, the transformation was too complete to reverse through conventional means. Mimir's personal involvement in these operations required him to maintain multiple identities and personas across the realms. In Nidavellir, he was known as a scholar of ancient metallurgy. In Alfheim, he appeared as a philosopher studying the relationship between light and truth. In Jotunheim, he presented himself as a historian interested in preserving giant cultural heritage. Each identity was carefully crafted to appeal to the specific interests and values of its target audience, while providing cover for intelligence-gathering activities. Maintaining these multiple personas required extraordinary psychological discipline and acting ability. Mimir had to remember not only what information each identity should possess, but also how each personality would react to different situations, and what values each character would prioritize in making decisions. The cognitive load of this deception would have been overwhelming for most beings, but Mimir's ancient wisdom and vast intellectual capacity made it manageable. The emotional cost was considerably higher. Each relationship he built under false pretenses, each friendship he cultivated for intelligence purposes, each act of betrayal he committed in service of his greater plan, added weight to his already burdened conscience. He was not a sociopath who felt no emotional connection to his victims. He was a being capable of genuine affection and respect, who chose to sacrifice his own moral comfort for what he believed was the greater good. The intelligence networks Mimir constructed during this period would remain active and effective for centuries, providing the foundation for virtually every major operation Asgard conducted across the 9 realms. They enabled the giant genocide, facilitated the suppression of various resistance movements, and provided early warning of threats that might otherwise have caught the Æsir unprepared. In every meaningful sense, they represented Mimir's greatest contribution to Æsir military and political dominance. Yet they also represented his greatest weapon against that same dominance. Every agent recruited to serve Asgard's interests was also a potential asset who could be activated when the time came to bring about Asgard's destruction. Every communication channel established to coordinate Æsir operations could also be used to coordinate resistance activities. Every piece of intelligence gathered to strengthen Odin's position could also be used to identify vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The irony was perfect and complete. The very networks that made Æsir rule possible across the 9 realms also made its eventual overthrow inevitable. Mimir had spent centuries building the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in cosmic history, and he had built it in such a way that it would ultimately serve the destruction of those who believed they controlled it. The smartest man alive had created the perfect trap, and his enemies had willingly walked into it while believing they were achieving their greatest triumph. The prophecy arrived in Asgard like a poisoned arrow shot from the shadows of fate itself. It came not through grand revelations or divine visions, but through the accumulated whispers of a dozen different sources, each carrying fragments of the same terrible truth. Seers across the 9 realms had begun experiencing identical nightmares. Ancient texts, previously thought to be mythological fiction, were revealing themselves to contain disturbingly accurate predictions about current events. Most ominously, the Norns themselves had begun weaving patterns into the threads of fate that suggested approaching cosmic catastrophe. Mimir was among the first to recognize the significance of these scattered omens, not because he possessed greater prophetic abilities than other wise beings, but because he understood what the prophecies actually represented. The visions of Ragnarok that were beginning to surface across the realms were not warnings about a distant possible future. They were confirmations that the cosmic cycle was proceeding exactly as it should, approaching the point where divine corruption had become so complete that renewal through destruction was the only viable path forward. The prophecies spoke of a great wolf that would devour the sun, of the world tree trembling as ancient bindings failed, of gods falling in battle against enemies they had created through their own hubris. But most specifically, and most dangerously for Odin personally, they spoke of the All-Father's death at the fangs of Fenrir, the wolf he would sire through his own actions, and then attempt to prevent through methods that would ensure its fulfillment. Frigg was the first among the Æsir to take these prophecies seriously, her maternal instincts awakened by references to threats against her beloved son Baldr. The All-Mother's concerns were not initially focused on the broader implications of Ragnarok, but on the specific predictions about her child's death. Yet her investigations into those particular prophecies inevitably led her to the larger pattern of cosmic destruction that surrounded them. Mimir found himself in the delicate position of having to counsel both Odin and Frigg about the prophecies, while managing their very different responses to the information. Odin's reaction was characteristically aggressive and controlling. He wanted to identify every possible threat and eliminate it before it could manifest. Frigg's approach was more nuanced, but equally problematic. She sought to protect what she loved through defensive measures that would inevitably draw attention to the very vulnerabilities she was trying to shield. The All-Father's first instinct was to suppress the prophecies entirely, forbidding their discussion and confiscating any texts that contained references to Ragnarok. This approach might have been effective if the predictions were merely political propaganda or enemy disinformation, but prophecies rooted in genuine cosmic necessity could not be silenced through censorship. The more aggressively Odin attempted to suppress knowledge of the predictions, the more they seemed to spread through unofficial channels. Mimir counseled a different approach, one that appeared wiser on the surface, but was actually designed to accelerate the fulfillment of the very prophecies. Odin hoped to prevent, rather than attempting to suppress the predictions. He suggested Asgard should study them carefully to identify specific threats and develop countermeasures. This rational response had the advantage of appearing both prudent and proactive, while ensuring that Odin would take exactly the actions necessary to bring about his own doom. The establishment of the Prophetic Council represented Odin's attempt to systematize the study of fate and prediction in ways that would serve Æsir interests. The council brought together the most skilled seers, wisest scholars, and most experienced practitioners of divination magic from across the 9 realms. Their mandate was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. They were to determine which prophecies were genuine warnings that required action, and which were false visions that could be safely ignored. Mimir played a crucial role in the council's formation, helping to select its members and establish its operating procedures. His recommendations appeared to prioritize competence and reliability, but they actually ensured that the council would reach conclusions that served his hidden agenda. The seers he recommended were genuinely skilled, but they were also individuals whose personalities and magical specializations made them likely to interpret prophecies in ways that would encourage rather than prevent their fulfillment. The council's first major analysis focused on the prophecies surrounding Baldr's death, since these seemed most urgent and specific in their implications. Multiple sources had predicted that the beloved god would die through treachery, involving mistletoe, the only substance in all the 9 realms that had not sworn an oath to avoid harming him. The council's recommendations for preventing this fate were logical, comprehensive, and absolutely guaranteed to ensure its occurrence. Rather than simply destroying all mistletoe plants, which might have been effective but would have raised questions about why such drastic measures were necessary, the council recommended a more sophisticated approach. Mistletoe would be gathered from across the realms and placed under divine protection in secure locations where its dangerous properties could be contained. This solution appeared to eliminate the threat while actually concentrating it in ways that would make the eventual tragedy easier to orchestrate. Fregg's oath-taking campaign, designed to secure promises from everything in existence that it would not harm Baldr, represented another example of defensive measures that created the very vulnerabilities they were meant to prevent. The ritual of requiring formal oaths from every object, creature, and force in the 9 realms was both practically impossible and strategically counterproductive. It drew attention to Baldr's prophesied vulnerability while creating a false sense of security based on incomplete protection. Mimir observed these preparations with the mixed emotions of someone watching a beloved friend walk willingly toward their own destruction. He genuinely cared for Baldr, whose noble character and innocent nature made him one of the few truly admirable figures in Asgard's increasingly corrupt divine hierarchy. Yet Baldr's very goodness made him a threat to the moral degradation that Mimir needed to cultivate among the Æsir. A god of such obvious virtue could not be allowed to provide an alternative to Odin's path of increasingly desperate pragmatism. The psychological effect of the prophecies on Odin himself was perhaps the most significant development of this period. The All-Father, who had built his rule on the foundation of superior knowledge and strategic planning, found himself confronted with information that suggested his ultimate defeat was not only possible, but inevitable. This knowledge ate at him like a slow poison, undermining his confidence and driving him toward increasingly erratic behavior. Sleep became elusive for the god who had once rested easily in the knowledge of his own supremacy. Odin began experiencing nightmares that seemed to blend prophecy with memory, showing him scenes of his own death intermingled with images of the atrocities he had committed to achieve and maintain power. These dreams were not random products of a troubled mind, but carefully crafted visions that Mimir influenced through subtle applications of magic and psychology. The All-Father's growing paranoia manifested in increased surveillance of his own pantheon and subjects. Gods who had once enjoyed his complete trust found themselves subjected to scrutiny and questioning. Loyal servants discovered that their access to sensitive information had been restricted without explanation. Even members of Odin's own family began to notice that their conversations with the All-Father were being monitored and analyzed for signs of potential disloyalty. This internal suspicion created exactly the kind of instability within Asgard's power structure that Mimir had been working to engineer for centuries. Gods who had never considered betraying Odin began to question whether their loyalty was appreciated or reciprocated. Servants who had devoted their existence to serving Æsir interests started to wonder whether their sacrifices had any meaning beyond maintaining the power of an increasingly unstable tyrant. The first direct confrontation between prophecy and divine will occurred when Odin attempted to prevent the birth of Fenrir by interfering with Loki's relationships and reproductive activities. The All-Father's ham-fisted efforts to control cosmic fate through political manipulation only succeeded in alienating Loki and driving him toward the very actions that would produce the prophesied threat. The wolf that would eventually devour Odin was conceived as a direct result of the All-Father's attempts to prevent its existence. Mimir watched this cosmic irony unfold with the satisfaction of someone seeing a complex plan reach a crucial milestone. Every action Odin took to prevent the prophecies from coming true created the conditions necessary for their fulfillment. Every defensive measure implemented to protect Æsir interests actually weakened those interests by revealing their vulnerabilities. Every attempt to control fate only demonstrated how completely fate controlled the would-be controllers. The emergence of new threats that seemed designed specifically to exploit Æsir weaknesses provided additional evidence that cosmic justice was beginning to reassert itself. Giants who had previously avoided direct confrontation with Asgard suddenly began developing weapons and tactics that countered traditional Æsir advantages. Former allies started questioning treaty obligations that had previously been considered inviolate. Even the natural forces that had long favored divine rule began to show signs of instability and unpredictability. These developments were not coincidental. They represented the fruits of Mimir's decades-long campaign to plant the seeds of Asgard's destruction throughout the cosmic order. Every intelligence network he had established now provided information to Asgard's enemies. Every cultural modification he had orchestrated now served to undermine rather than strengthen Æsir influence. Every relationship he had cultivated now became a potential source of betrayal and opposition. The philosophical implications of prophecy itself became a source of division within Asgard's intellectual community. Traditional Æsir thinking emphasized the power of will and determination to shape reality according to divine desires. The prophecies of Ragnarok suggested that some aspects of reality were beyond divine control, that fate operated according to laws that even gods could not violate. This fundamental challenge to Æsir ideology created cognitive dissonance that weakened the Pantheon's unity and confidence. Scholars, who had spent centuries developing theories about divine supremacy, found themselves forced to reconsider basic assumptions about the nature of power and causality. Philosophers, who had argued that gods were limited only by their own imagination, discovered that imagination itself might be constrained by cosmic necessities beyond their understanding. The intellectual foundations of Æsir rule began to crumble as thinkers grappled with evidence that their fundamental worldview was incomplete or incorrect. Mimir encouraged these philosophical debates while carefully shaping their direction and conclusions. He posed questions that appeared to seek clarification but actually introduced doubts and contradictions. He provided evidence that seemed to support Æsir positions but actually undermined them through subtle implications. Most importantly, he helped frame the discussion in ways that made acceptance of prophetic inevitability seem like the most reasonable and sophisticated position available. The cumulative effect of these various pressures was to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety within Asgard that had not existed since the early days of Odin's rise to power. Gods who had grown comfortable with their positions found themselves questioning whether those positions would survive the prophesied catastrophe. Servants who had believed their loyalty would be rewarded began to wonder whether loyalty itself had any meaning in a cosmos where fate might override divine gratitude. This psychological transformation of Asgard's ruling class was precisely what Mimir had been working to achieve since the beginning of his service to Odin. The confident, united pantheon that had conquered the 9 realms was being replaced by a collection of frightened, suspicious individuals who no longer trusted each other or believed in their own invincibility. The first cracks in their divine facade had appeared, and those cracks would only widen as the pressure continued to increase. The systematic extermination of the giants began not with grand declarations of war or dramatic battles, but with quiet disappearances that went unnoticed by all except those who were meant to notice them. Entire bloodlines simply vanished from their ancient homes in Jotunheim, leaving behind empty halls and abandoned settlements that spoke eloquently of the thoroughness with which Odin's new policy was being implemented. The All-Father had decided that prophecy could be defeated through genocide, and Mimir found himself serving as both architect and secret saboteur of the most comprehensive campaign of divine ethnic cleansing ever undertaken. The official justification for the giant war was elegantly crafted to appeal to Æsir fears and prejudices while obscuring its true genocidal nature. Giants, Odin proclaimed, represented an existential threat to the stability of the 9 realms. Their chaotic nature and primitive thinking made them incapable of accepting civilized governance. More dangerously, their prophetic traditions and mystical knowledge gave them access to information that could destabilize the cosmic order if it fell into the wrong hands. Mimir contributed to these justifications while secretly documenting their falseness for posterity. He knew that giant civilization was neither chaotic nor primitive, Having spent centuries studying their sophisticated magical traditions and complex social structures, giant prophetic knowledge was dangerous to Æsir rule, not because it was inherently destabilizing, but because it revealed the moral corruption and ultimate unsustainability of that rule. The giants had to die not because they threatened cosmic order, but because they represented cosmic justice. The military campaign itself was a masterpiece of tactical efficiency and strategic horror. Rather than engaging giant forces in honorable combat, where their size and strength might provide advantages, Odin's armies employed tactics specifically designed to minimize risk to Æsir forces, while maximizing casualties among their enemies. Poisoned water sources eliminated entire communities without warning. Magical plagues targeted giant physiology specifically, leaving other species unaffected. Most effectively, coordinated strikes eliminated giant leadership before rank-and-file warriors even knew they were under attack. Mimir's intelligence networks proved invaluable for identifying targets and coordinating these attacks. His decades of relationship building within giant communities provided detailed information about their defensive capabilities, leadership structures, and population centers. The trust he had cultivated through scholarly exchanges and cultural preservation efforts now served to pinpoint the locations where Æsir forces could inflict maximum damage with minimum resistance. The moral weight of this betrayal was almost unbearable. Mimir watched as giants he had known personally, beings he respected and genuinely liked, fell victim to attacks that his information had made possible. Utgard Loki, whose correspondence on matters of ancient philosophy had provided insights that enriched Mimir's own understanding, died defending a library that Æsir forces burned specifically because Mimir had identified it as a repository of dangerous prophetic texts. Yet even as he enabled these atrocities, Mimir was working to subvert them in ways that served his ultimate purpose. Not every piece of intelligence he provided was accurate. Certain giant communities received warnings that allowed them to evacuate before Æsir forces arrived. Key individuals whose knowledge or bloodlines might prove important for the post-Ragnarok renewal were secretly provided with escape routes and safe passage to hidden refuges beyond Odin's reach. The most significant of these preservation efforts involved the protection of the giant prophetic traditions that Odin was so determined to destroy. Mimir understood that these prophecies contained not only predictions about Ragnarok, but instructions for what must happen afterward to ensure that the cosmic cycle continued properly. Allowing this knowledge to be lost would transform necessary destruction into meaningless devastation, preventing the renewal that was supposed to follow the death of the gods. Working through intermediaries and false identities, Mimir orchestrated the evacuation of crucial prophetic texts and artifacts to secure locations where they would survive the coming catastrophe. Hidden libraries were established in remote corners of various realms, protected by powerful magic, and tended by survivors who understood their cosmic importance. The knowledge that Odin sought to destroy was actually being preserved and prepared for its eventual role in rebuilding what his destruction would tear down. The psychological transformation of the Æsir forces engaged in the genocide was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire campaign. Gods who had once possessed genuine nobility of character found themselves participating in atrocities that would have horrified their younger selves. The cognitive dissonance created by the gap between their idealized self-images and their actual actions was resolved through increasingly elaborate rationalizations and increasingly callous attitudes toward their victims. Thor's participation in the giant genocide marked his transformation from a somewhat crude but fundamentally decent warrior into something far darker and more troubling. The god of thunder's natural impulses toward protection and justice were gradually warped into weapons of oppression and murder. His hammer Mjolnir, originally crafted as a tool for defending the innocent, became an instrument for crushing anyone who threatened Æsir supremacy. Mimir observed Thor's corruption with particular interest, because he recognized that the thunder god's moral degradation was essential for the eventual fulfillment of the Ragnarok prophecies. The Thor who would face the world serpent in final battle needed to be someone whose death would represent cosmic justice rather than tragic loss. The noble warrior was being systematically transformed into someone whose destruction would improve rather than diminish the universe. The efficiency with which giant culture was being erased was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, even as it was morally horrifying. Æsir forces didn't simply kill giants, they eliminated every trace of their existence. Libraries were burned, artifacts were destroyed. Even the landscapes where giants had lived were sometimes altered to remove evidence of their former presence. It was as if Odin hoped to make the giant people disappear so completely that the universe itself would forget they had ever existed. This systematic cultural destruction served Mimir's purposes by creating exactly the kind of cosmic injustice that would demand eventual reckoning. The universe has mechanisms for maintaining balance, and atrocities of this magnitude inevitably generate compensatory forces that work to restore equilibrium. Every act of genocide created moral debt that would eventually have to be paid by those who incurred it. The few giant survivors who managed to escape the initial waves of extermination found themselves in an impossible situation. They were too few and too scattered to mount effective resistance against Æsir forces, but they were also too visible to hide successfully for extended periods. Most faced the choice between hopeless resistance that would end in death and submission that would end in slavery. A third option, however, was quietly made available to those who possessed information or abilities that might prove useful for future operations. Mimir, working through carefully maintained cover identities, recruited surviving giants into a network that appeared to serve Æsir intelligence interests, but actually worked to preserve giant knowledge and prepare for eventual vengeance against their oppressors. These recruits believed they were collaborating with their enemies out of necessity, but they were actually serving a cosmic plan that would ultimately deliver the justice they sought. The recruitment of giant collaborators required extraordinary psychological manipulation and moral flexibility on Mimir's part. He had to convince desperate survivors that betraying their own people was acceptable if it served larger strategic purposes. More challenging still, he had to maintain their loyalty and effectiveness while keeping them ignorant of the true scope of the plan they were serving. Each individual knew only enough to perform their specific role, preventing them from jeopardizing the entire operation if they were captured or chose to defect. The intelligence gathered through these giant assets proved invaluable for both the continuing genocide and its eventual consequences. Information about hidden giant communities allowed Æsir forces to complete their extermination campaign with ruthless efficiency. Simultaneously, intelligence about Æsir methods and weaknesses gathered by the same assets was carefully preserved for use by future enemies of Asgard's rule. As the giant genocide approached completion, its effects on the broader cosmic order became increasingly apparent. The elimination of such a significant portion of the universe's wisdom-keeping population created imbalances that manifested in disturbing ways. Prophecies became harder to interpret as the beings who understood their deeper meanings were killed. Ancient magical traditions began to fail as the bloodlines that maintained them were exterminated. Even the fundamental forces of nature seemed less stable, as if the universe itself was struggling to function properly, with such a large piece of its consciousness violently removed. These cosmic disturbances were not accidental byproducts of the genocide, but necessary preconditions for the catastrophic renewal that Ragnarok represented. The universe needed to be destabilized significantly before it could be rebuilt on better foundations. The elimination of the giants was removing crucial supports from the cosmic order, ensuring that when the final collapse came, it would be complete enough to allow genuine transformation rather than mere reformation. Odin's reaction to the success of his genocide campaign revealed the extent to which the All-Father himself had been corrupted by his own actions. Rather than expressing relief that a supposed threat had been eliminated, he seemed energized by the demonstration of his power to erase entire peoples from existence. The god who had once shown at least some restraint in his use of force now spoke casually about applying similar solutions to other groups that might pose challenges to Æsir rule. The completion of the giant genocide marked a crucial turning point in Mimir's long-term manipulation campaign. The moral corruption of the Æsir was now complete and irreversible. The cosmic injustices necessary to justify their destruction had been committed. The survivors and knowledge required for post-Ragnarok renewal had been secretly preserved. Most importantly, the universe itself had been pushed to the point where catastrophic change was not only inevitable, but necessary for its continued existence. The smartest man alive had successfully orchestrated the transformation of Odin from an ambitious but relatively ethical ruler into a genocidal tyrant whose actions demanded cosmic punishment. The seeds of vengeance had been planted not only in the hearts of giant survivors, but in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The rising tide of retribution was building toward the moment when it would sweep away everything that Æsir rule represented, clearing the ground for something better to grow in its place. Yet even as he achieved this crucial milestone, Mimir understood that his most dangerous work still lay ahead. The genocide was complete, but Odin was not yet ready for his final downfall. The All-Father would need to be driven to even greater extremes of desperation and moral compromise before he would be vulnerable to the trap that was slowly closing around him. The vengeance that was rising would need to be carefully shaped and directed to ensure that it achieved renewal rather than mere destruction. The cosmic justice that was building toward its inevitable expression would need guidance from someone who understood its true purpose and could help it achieve its most constructive possible form. The binding of Fenrir represented Odin's most catastrophic attempt to cheat fate, and Mimir watched the All-Father orchestrate his own doom with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing a master craftsman forge the weapon that would kill him. The great wolf, already grown to enormous size despite his youth, had become too dangerous to roam freely through Asgard, yet too valuable as a potential asset to simply destroy. Odin's solution was characteristically arrogant in its assumption that divine cleverness could overcome cosmic necessity through superior planning and execution. The creation of Gleipnir, the magical chain that would bind Fenrir, required resources and knowledge that pushed even Æsir capabilities to their absolute limits. The 6 impossible ingredients, gathered from across the 9 realms, represented not just rare materials, but fundamental forces of reality itself, made manifest in physical form. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the sinews of a bear, the spittle of a bird. Each component was a paradox, made tangible. Existence wrested from impossibility through applications of magic that violated natural law. Mimir's role in the Gleipnir project was ostensibly that of theoretical consultant, providing the deep understanding of cosmic principles necessary to transform contradictory concepts into functional materials. His contributions appeared to serve Æsir interests by making the binding possible, but his true purpose was far more subtle. Every suggestion he made, every insight he provided, every solution he offered was carefully calculated to ensure that the chain would hold Fenrir physically, while simultaneously guaranteeing that it would fail to prevent the wolf's prophesied role in Odin's destruction. The psychological manipulation required to convince Fenrir to allow himself to be bound was perhaps the most morally reprehensible aspect of the entire operation. The young wolf, despite his fearsome size and growing power, still possessed the trust and innocence of youth. He believed that the gods who had raised him were acting in good faith when they proposed the binding as a test of strength. His willingness to participate in what he thought was a game made his betrayal all the more devastating when he realized its true nature. Tyr's sacrifice of his hand to gain Fenrir's cooperation transformed the god of war from a figure of honor into a symbol of divine duplicity. The loss of his hand was genuine, and the pain was real, but the nobility of the sacrifice was completely undermined by its purpose. Tyr was not giving up his hand to save others from danger, but to enable the betrayal of someone who trusted him. The physical wound would heal, but the moral injury would fester until it poisoned everything the god of war had once represented. Mimir observed the binding ceremony with emotions that warred between satisfaction at his plan's success and revulsion at the methods required to achieve it. Fenrir's realization that he had been deceived, his struggles against the impossible chain, his prophetic curse that he would eventually devour Odin himself, all of these served Mimir's ultimate purposes, while simultaneously demonstrating the depths to which the Æsir had sunk in their pursuit of security through treachery. The magical principles underlying Gleipnir's construction contained deliberate flaws that would ensure its eventual failure at precisely the moment when that failure would cause maximum damage to Æsir interests. The chain was designed to hold as long as cosmic equilibrium remained stable, but to weaken as the universe itself became unbalanced through divine corruption. The more atrocities the Æsir committed, the more unstable the cosmic order became, and the weaker Gleipnir's hold on Fenrir would grow. This elegant solution to the problem of timing required Mimir to embed complex magical algorithms into the chain's structure, calculations that would monitor cosmic moral balance and adjust the binding's strength accordingly. The mathematics involved were staggering in their complexity, requiring understanding of principles that connected individual actions to universal consequences across scales of space and time that boggled even divine comprehension. The imprisonment of Loki, Fenrir's father, represented another escalation in Odin's campaign to prevent prophecy through increasingly desperate measures. The trickster god's punishment for his role in Baldr's death was deliberately designed to be as psychologically devastating as it was physically painful. Bound beneath a serpent that dripped venom onto his face for eternity, Loki would serve as both victim and weapon, his suffering generating the rage that would eventually fuel his role as leader of the forces that would destroy Asgard. Mimir's involvement in designing Loki's torment was perhaps his most difficult moral compromise. The trickster god, for all his flaws and manipulations, had been a genuine friend whose wit and irreverence had provided welcome relief from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of Odin's court. Yet Loki's transformation into an enemy of cosmic proportions was essential for the eventual fulfillment of the Ragnarok prophecies. The psychological torture was carefully calibrated to produce exactly the right type and degree of hatred necessary to motivate Loki's future actions. Too little suffering might leave room for eventual reconciliation. Too much might drive him into madness that would make him ineffective as an agent of destruction. The punishment had to generate focused, intelligent rage that would sustain him through the centuries of planning required to orchestrate Asgard's downfall. Sigjin's loyalty to her tortured husband added another layer of complexity to the situation. Her devotion, catching the serpent's venom in a bowl to provide Loki with brief moments of relief, demonstrated that genuine love and loyalty still existed even in the corrupt world that Asgard had become. Yet her compassion also served to keep Loki's rage from burning out entirely, ensuring that his hatred would remain fresh and focused when the time came for him to act upon it. The magical research conducted during this period pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or ethical in divine society. Odin's desperation to find solutions to the prophecy problem led him to authorize investigations into forms of magic that had been forbidden since the dawn of the cosmic order. Ancient treaties with primordial forces were violated. Barriers between realms were weakened through experimental transportation magic. Most dangerously, attempts were made to manipulate the fundamental forces of fate itself. Mimir served as coordinator and overseer for much of this forbidden research, ensuring that the investigations appeared productive enough to maintain Odin's support while actually creating new vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time came for Asgard's destruction. Every breakthrough that seemed to strengthen Æsir capabilities also opened new avenues for attack by their enemies. Every solution to one problem created 3 new problems that would manifest at precisely the wrong moment. The ethical corruption of Asgard's magical practitioners during this period was systematic and deliberate. Researchers who had once refused to compromise their principles found themselves gradually accepting increasingly questionable methods in pursuit of solutions to seemingly existential threats. The logical progression from ethical research to torture-based experimentation was so gradual that most participants never recognized the transformation they had undergone. Young mages who entered the research programs as idealistic scholars emerged as callous manipulators of forces they barely understood and consequences they refused to acknowledge. The academic culture that had once prized wisdom and restraint was replaced by a desperate pragmatism that valued results over methods and effectiveness over ethics. The very institutions that should have preserved divine moral standards became instruments for their systematic destruction. The development of new forms of surveillance magic allowed Odin to monitor his subjects with unprecedented precision and invasiveness. Every conversation could be overheard, every private moment observed, every secret thought potentially detected and analyzed. The All-Father's paranoia had evolved into a comprehensive system of divine totalitarianism that eliminated privacy and personal autonomy throughout his domain. These surveillance capabilities were ostensibly designed to prevent rebellion and identify potential threats before they could materialize. In practice, they created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made rebellion more likely rather than less. Gods who had never considered opposing Odin's rule began to plot against him simply because they could not tolerate living under constant observation and suspicion. Mimir's position as coordinator of the surveillance network gave him access to information about every potential source of opposition within Asgard's sphere of influence. This intelligence was invaluable for identifying individuals who might be turned against the regime when the time came for open resistance. More importantly, it allowed him to manipulate the information Odin received, shaping the All-Father's perceptions of threats and opportunities in ways that served the long-term goal of bringing about his downfall. The magical experiments conducted in secret laboratories throughout Asgard produced innovations that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. Weapons that could kill immortal beings, transportation systems that could move armies across dimensional barriers instantaneously, communication networks that could coordinate operations across multiple realms simultaneously. Each breakthrough represented a genuine triumph of magical engineering that enhanced Æsir military capabilities dramatically. Yet every innovation was also a potential vulnerability that could be turned against its creators if the proper counters were developed and deployed effectively. Mimir ensured that detailed specifications for every new weapon and system were secretly recorded and preserved for future use by Asgard's enemies. The very tools that Odin hoped would secure his rule forever would eventually become the instruments of his destruction. The psychological pressure of conducting increasingly extreme research while maintaining facades of moral respectability took a severe toll on everyone involved in the forbidden projects. Many researchers developed stress-related disorders that manifested as magical instabilities, making them liabilities rather than assets to the programs they served. Others experienced moral crises that led them to question not only their work, but the entire divine order that sanctioned such activities. These psychological casualties served Mimir's purposes by creating additional sources of potential opposition within Asgard's power structure. Gods who had been broken by their involvement in unethical research often became willing to provide information about divine vulnerabilities to anyone who promised them redemption or revenge. The system designed to strengthen Odin's position was actually creating enemies from within his own ranks. The culmination of this period came with Odin's decision to seek knowledge of the future through methods that violated every principle of wisdom and restraint that had once guided divine behavior. the All-Father's hanging from Yggdrasil, his sacrifice of his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, his pursuit of runic knowledge through self-torture, all of these represented attempts to gain power through suffering that fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. The irony was perfect and complete. Odin's desperate quest for the information he needed to prevent his own destruction actually provided him with the knowledge that made that destruction inevitable. Every secret he uncovered, every prophecy he understood, every magical principle he mastered served to convince him that increasingly extreme measures were necessary to preserve his rule. The wisdom he sought became the weapon that would ultimately be used to destroy him. Mimir had spent centuries guiding the All-Father toward this moment of ultimate moral corruption, when divine pragmatism would finally reveal itself as simple evil dressed in sophisticated justifications. The desperate measures that Odin believed would save him had instead sealed his doom, and the smartest man alive had been there every step of the way, helping to forge the chains that would bind the god who thought himself free. The moment of revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or explosive accusation, but through the quiet accumulation of small inconsistencies that finally reached a critical mass in Odin's increasingly paranoid mind. For centuries, the All-Father had dismissed minor discrepancies in intelligence reports, occasional failures of perfectly planned operations, and the persistent ability of his enemies to anticipate Æsir's strategies with uncanny accuracy. The explanation had always been simple enemy cunning, random chance, or the inherent unpredictability of cosmic forces beyond divine control. But paranoia, once awakened, possesses a terrible logic that transforms coincidence into conspiracy and accident into deliberate sabotage. Odin's growing suspicion of everyone around him eventually turned its searchlight upon the one person who had been beyond suspicion for so long that his loyalty had become a fundamental assumption of divine governance. The smartest man alive had been too careful, too successful, too perfectly positioned to serve Æsir interests for his very perfection not to eventually arouse suspicion. The investigation that would expose Mimir's true role began with a routine audit of intelligence operations, the kind of bureaucratic review that the All-Father conducted periodically to ensure that his vast networks remained efficient and secure. What started as administrative oversight gradually evolved into something more focused and dangerous as patterns emerged that could not be explained by chance or coincidence. Too many operations had failed at crucial moments, despite perfect planning and adequate resources. Too many enemies had escaped traps that should have been inescapable. Too many pieces of vital intelligence had somehow found their way to hostile forces, despite being classified at the highest levels of divine security. Most troubling of all, the timing of these failures suggested coordination rather than random misfortune. Mimir was aware that his activities were under scrutiny, his vast intelligence network having detected the investigation almost as soon as it began. Yet he made no attempt to flee or cover his tracks more thoroughly. The time for such measures had passed long ago, and besides, discovery had always been part of his long-term plan. The cosmic forces he served required that his betrayal be revealed at precisely the right moment to achieve maximum effect. The evidence that would ultimately condemn him was hidden in plain sight, embedded within the very systems he had created to serve Odin's interests. Every intelligence report he had filed, every strategic recommendation he had made, every operational plan he had developed, contained subtle markers that revealed his true allegiances to anyone who knew what to look for. The All-Father's investigation team, guided by Odin's increasingly sophisticated understanding of intelligence analysis, gradually learned to recognize these hidden signatures. The breakthrough came when cryptographers analyzing Mimir's communications discovered that his reports contained embedded messages readable only by those who possessed specific keys derived from giant prophetic traditions. The mathematical elegance of the encryption was stunning in its complexity, but its very sophistication proved its hostile intent. No loyal servant would have need for such elaborate secrecy in communicating with his own master. The decrypted messages revealed the scope of Mimir's betrayal in devastating detail. For centuries, the smartest man alive had been systematically undermining every aspect of Æsir power while appearing to serve it faithfully. Intelligence networks, established to protect Asgard, had been turned into weapons aimed at its heart. Strategic plans designed to strengthen divine rule had been subtly modified to create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Most damning of all, the very prophecies that Odin feared had been actively encouraged and facilitated by the advisor he trusted most. Odin's reaction to these revelations was everything that Mimir had anticipated, and more. The All-Father's rage was cosmic in its scale, shaking the foundations of Asgard and sending tremors through the world tree itself. The god who had prided himself on his wisdom and cunning discovered that he had been outmaneuvered for centuries by someone he had considered a mere subordinate. The humiliation was perhaps more painful than the betrayal itself. The confrontation between the two ancient beings took place in the deepest vault beneath Asgard's great library, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that no longer existed. Mimir had chosen this location deliberately, knowing that the irony would not be lost on either of them. Here, among the preserved wisdom of the dead, the living embodiment of knowledge would face judgment for his crimes against power. Odin arrived bearing Gungnir, the spear that never missed its target, though they both understood that the weapon was more symbol than threat in this context. The All-Father's rage was too great for quick violence, his wounded pride demanding confession and explanation before it would accept satisfaction through mere death. He needed to understand how he had been deceived so completely for so long by someone he had trusted absolutely. Mimir offered no denials, no justifications, no pleas for mercy or understanding. His confession was complete and unflinching, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had always known this moment would come and had prepared for it accordingly. Yes, he had betrayed every trust placed in him. Yes, he had systematically undermined Æsir power from within. Yes, he had actively worked to ensure that the prophecies of Ragnarok would be fulfilled exactly as foretold. The intellectual honesty of this admission only increased Odin's fury. A lying betrayer could be dismissed as a simple criminal, but Mimir's forthright acknowledgement of his actions elevated them to the level of philosophical statement. This was not mere treachery, but deliberate moral judgment, the universe's wisdom incarnate passing sentence on divine corruption and finding it deserving of destruction. The All-Father's questions came in torrents, each one seeking to understand a different aspect of the conspiracy that had been operating under his nose for millennia. How long had Mimir been planning this betrayal? From the very beginning of their relationship came the calm reply. What was his ultimate objective? The necessary destruction and renewal of the cosmic order that Æsir rule had corrupted beyond redemption. Did he feel any remorse for the deaths his actions had caused? Only for the necessity that had made such deaths inevitable. Each answer was perfectly calculated to maximize Odin's rage while demonstrating the cosmic necessity that had motivated every action. Mimir was not a criminal seeking personal gain or petty revenge, but an agent of universal justice carrying out a sentence that had been passed by existence itself. The All-Father's anger was understandable but irrelevant, the fury of a condemned prisoner raging against the executioner who would carry out a just verdict. The revelation of specific betrayals and their consequences created a cascade of realizations that restructured Odin's understanding of his entire reign. The Vanir War had been prolonged unnecessarily by intelligence leaks that warned the enemy of Æsir plans. The giant genocide had been less complete than believed because key targets had been warned in advance. Even the binding of Fenrir had been compromised from within, ensuring that the wolf would eventually break free at the worst possible moment. Most devastating of all was the realization that Mimir's betrayal had not been discovered through Odin's superior cunning or improved security measures. It had been revealed because Mimir had chosen to reveal it, timing his exposure to coincide with the cosmic moment when his capture would serve the larger purpose of bringing about Asgard's destruction. Even this final victory was an illusion, another manipulation by an enemy who had never stopped being several moves ahead of his supposed master. The psychological impact of these revelations on Odin was profound and immediate. The god who had built his identity around his superior wisdom and strategic thinking discovered that he had been intellectually dominated for centuries by someone he had dismissed as a mere advisor. Every major decision of his reign had been influenced by someone whose ultimate loyalty lay with his enemies. The very foundation of his self-concept crumbled as he realized the extent to which his supposed triumphs had been orchestrated by the forces working for his downfall. Mimir watched this psychological collapse with emotions that mixed satisfaction with genuine sadness. He had never taken pleasure in causing suffering, even to those who deserved punishment for their crimes. The destruction of Odin's peace of mind was necessary for cosmic justice, but it was still the breaking of a being who had once possessed admirable qualities before power and fear had corrupted him beyond redemption. The All-Father's attempts to extract information about co-conspirators and ongoing operations met with polite but absolute refusal. Mimir would confess to his own crimes completely, but he would not compromise others who served the cause of cosmic renewal. His network of allies and agents would remain hidden, protected by his silence, even as he faced eternal punishment for his role in their conspiracy. The futility of torture as a means of compelling cooperation became apparent almost immediately. Mimir's ancient wisdom included complete mastery over his own pain responses, allowing him to endure any physical suffering without surrendering information he chose to protect. More importantly, his absolute certainty about the righteousness of his cause made him immune to psychological pressure based on guilt or fear. Odin's growing frustration with his prisoner's resistance led to increasingly creative and vicious attempts to break his will. The All-Father drew upon his vast knowledge of magical torture techniques, inflicting suffering that would have driven lesser beings insane within moments. Yet Mimir endured everything with the serene acceptance of someone who understood that his pain served a cosmic purpose that transcended personal comfort. The decision to preserve Mimir's head while allowing his body to die represented Odin's final attempt to extract value from his betrayer while ensuring that the punishment fit the crime. The smartest man alive would spend eternity as a source of information for the regime he had sought to destroy, his vast knowledge serving Æsir interests even as his consciousness suffered the torments of the damned. Yet even this punishment had been anticipated and prepared for by the being who had orchestrated his own capture. The preserved head that Odin believed would serve his purposes was actually the final piece in a cosmic trap that had been centuries in the making. The All-Father thought he was claiming victory over his betrayer, but he was actually completing the mechanism that would ensure his own destruction. The irony was perfect in its completeness. Mimir's apparent defeat was actually his ultimate triumph, the moment when his long-term strategy reached its culmination. The smartest man alive had allowed himself to be captured and tortured, not because he had failed, but because his success required this sacrifice. The great divine betrayal was not Mimir's betrayal of Odin, but reality's betrayal of divine arrogance, with Mimir serving as the instrument through which cosmic justice would finally be served. The torture of Mimir began immediately after his confession, but the methods employed revealed more about Odin's psychological state than about any practical need for information. The All-Father's rage demanded physical expression, yet his wounded pride required a more sophisticated form of revenge than simple execution could provide. The smartest man alive would suffer in ways that matched the intellectual nature of his betrayal, his vast mind becoming the instrument of its own torment. The initial sessions focused on conventional applications of divine power, pain inflicted through magical manipulation of nerve endings and sensory perception. Mimir endured these crude attempts with the stoic acceptance of someone who had anticipated far worse treatment. His calm responses only increased Odin's frustration, driving the All-Father toward more creative and psychologically devastating approaches to punishment. The breakthrough in torture technique came when Odin realized that Mimir's greatest strength could be turned into his greatest vulnerability. The ancient being's vast knowledge, accumulated over eons of careful study and observation, became the raw material for torments specifically designed to exploit his intellectual nature. Rather than attacking his body, the All-Father began to attack his mind directly. The first psychic assault involved forced reliving of every moment when Mimir's actions had caused suffering to innocent beings. The moral weight of his necessary betrayals, carefully suppressed through philosophical rationalization, was stripped of its justifications and experienced as pure emotional trauma. Every giant child who had died because of intelligence he provided, every loyal servant who had suffered because of operations he compromised, every friend he had manipulated in service of his cosmic purpose, all became sources of overwhelming guilt and self-recrimination. This psychological torture was far more effective than physical pain in breaking down Mimir's emotional defenses. The ancient being had prepared himself to endure any amount of bodily suffering, but the concentrated experience of moral consequence without the buffer of intellectual justification proved nearly unbearable. For the first time since his capture, genuine anguish replaced stoic acceptance on his features. Yet even this sophisticated torment failed to achieve Odin's ultimate objective of compelling cooperation. Mimir's commitment to his cosmic purpose ran deeper than his capacity for guilt or self-doubt. The suffering was real and terrible, but it was also temporary. While the consequences of betraying his allies would be eternal, he absorbed the psychological assault as he had absorbed the physical torture, transforming pain into fuel for his continued resistance. The All-Father's escalating desperation led him to experiment with forms of punishment that violated fundamental laws governing the treatment of prisoners, even those guilty of the highest crimes. Divine convention required that torture serve some practical purpose, whether extracting information or compelling compliance. What Odin was inflicting upon Mimir served no purpose beyond satisfying his wounded ego and expressing his rage at being outmaneuvered so completely. The magical techniques employed grew increasingly exotic and dangerous as conventional methods proved inadequate. Time dilation spells stretched moments of agony into subjective eternities. Sensory multiplication amplified pain beyond the normal limits of consciousness. Most horrifically, temporal loops forced Mimir to experience his worst memories repeatedly, each repetition fresh and traumatic as if happening for the first time. These experiments pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even in Asgard's increasingly corrupt moral climate. Other gods began to express discomfort with the sounds that emerged from the depths of the palace. Even though most remained ignorant of their true source, the psychological pressure of maintaining such extreme torture was taking a toll on Odin himself, driving him toward levels of cruelty that even his supporters found disturbing. The preservation of Mimir's head, while allowing his body to die, represented the culmination of this torture regimen and the beginning of a new phase of punishment designed to last for eternity. The magical techniques required to maintain consciousness in a severed head while preserving cognitive function were complex beyond normal comprehension, requiring applications of divine power that pushed even Odin's considerable abilities to their limits. The process itself was conducted with the precision of a master craftsman creating his greatest work. Every nerve ending was preserved and enhanced, ensuring that the capacity for suffering would remain intact. The sensory apparatus was modified to allow for new forms of perception while maintaining vulnerability to pain. Most importantly, the connection between consciousness and memory was strengthened, guaranteeing that every moment of torment would be remembered with perfect clarity. The installation of the preserved head at the Well of Knowledge represented both practical utility and symbolic statement. Mimir's vast wisdom would remain accessible to serve Asgard's interests, but his suffering would also serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of betraying divine authority. Every god who visited the well would see the price paid by those who challenged Odin's rule, their own loyalty reinforced by witnessing the fate of traitors. The irony of the location was not lost on either the torturer or his victim. The Well of Knowledge had been Mimir's first source of cosmic understanding, the place where he had gained the wisdom that would eventually drive him to oppose divine corruption. Now it would serve as the site of his eternal punishment, his enhanced consciousness trapped in a location that constantly reminded him of how his quest for truth had led to his downfall. The psychological impact of Mimir's fate on the rest of Asgard's population was immediate and profound. Gods who had never seriously considered opposing Odin's rule found themselves reevaluating their positions in light of what resistance might cost them. The message was clear: an unambiguous betrayal of any kind, for any reason, would result in suffering beyond imagination inflicted by someone whose capacity for creative cruelty had no apparent limits. This demonstration of absolute power had effects that went far beyond simple intimidation. It revealed to Asgard's divine community that their ruler had evolved into something fundamentally different from what he had been during the early days of his reign. The Odin, who had once shown mercy to defeated enemies and restraint in victory, had been replaced by someone whose thirst for control recognized no moral boundaries whatsoever. The deterioration of divine society, under the pressure of such extreme authoritarianism, became apparent almost immediately. Conversations became guarded and superficial, as gods learned to assume that everything they said might be reported to higher authorities. Innovation and creativity suffered as researchers and artists avoided any work that might be interpreted as subversive. Most damaging of all, the bonds of trust and friendship that had once held the Pantheon together began to dissolve under the corrosive influence of fear and suspicion. Mimir observed these developments with the detached interest of someone watching a carefully planned experiment reach its predicted conclusion. The social decay spreading through Asgard was not an unintended consequence of his exposure, but an essential component of the larger plan he had spent centuries implementing. Divine society had to be weakened from within before it could be destroyed from without. The timing of his revelation had been calculated to coincide with other pressures that would combine to create an unstoppable cascade of social and political collapse. The binding of Fenrir was beginning to weaken as cosmic moral balance shifted against the Æsir. Loki's rage was reaching the point where it would soon motivate him to begin active planning for revenge. Most importantly, the first stirrings of the force that would eventually become known as the Ghost of Sparta were beginning to make themselves felt in distant realms. The intelligence networks that Mimir had built over centuries continued to function even after his capture, their operations guided by procedures he had established and contingencies he had planned. His agents throughout the 9 realms received coded signals indicating that the final phase of their mission was beginning, activating sleeper cells and dormant operations that had been waiting decades for their moment to strike. The beauty of these networks lay in their independence from their creators' continued freedom. Mimir had designed them to function automatically once certain trigger conditions were met, requiring no direct supervision or coordination to achieve their objectives. His capture had actually served as one of those trigger conditions, launching operations that would accelerate Asgard's decline while appearing to be unrelated to his activities. Odin's attempts to uncover and dismantle these networks met with limited success, because their true scope and nature remained hidden beneath layers of misdirection and false identification. Every cell that was discovered and eliminated had been designed to reveal itself eventually, serving as a distraction while more important operations continued undetected. The All-Father found himself fighting shadows, never quite grasping the full extent of the conspiracy that operated around him. The psychological pressure of this hidden war began to take a visible toll on Odin's mental stability. The god who had once approached challenges with calm confidence became increasingly erratic and paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies everywhere he looked. His decision-making process, previously characterized by careful analysis and strategic thinking, devolved into reactive measures driven more by fear than by rational planning. This deterioration in leadership quality had cascading effects throughout Asgard's governmental structure. Subordinates found themselves trying to implement contradictory policies that reflected their rulers' changing moods rather than coherent strategic objectives. Allies grew confused and resentful as Æsir diplomacy became unpredictable and occasionally hostile without apparent provocation. Military commanders struggled to maintain effectiveness while operating under constantly shifting tactical doctrines. The economic foundations of Asgard's power began to show signs of strain as trade partners grew reluctant to deal with an increasingly unstable regime. The tribute system that had sustained divine prosperity for centuries became irregular as subject realms tested the boundaries of what they could withhold without triggering overwhelming retaliation. Most significantly, the flow of information that had given the Æsir their strategic advantages over enemies began to dry up as sources became compromised or frightened into silence. Cultural decay accompanied political and economic decline, as the values that had once defined Æsir civilization were abandoned in favor of crude pragmatism and fear-based control. Art that celebrated noble ideals was replaced by propaganda that emphasized obedience and conformity. Literature that explored complex moral questions gave way to simple narratives that glorified authority and demonized dissent. Even religious practices were modified to emphasize divine power rather than divine wisdom or justice. The transformation was so gradual and systematic that many gods failed to recognize its scope until the process was too advanced to reverse. They found themselves living in a society that bore little resemblance to the one they remembered from their youth. Yet the changes had occurred through such small increments that no single modification had seemed worthy of serious opposition. By the time the cumulative effect became apparent, resistance would have required overthrowing the entire system rather than simply reforming problematic policies. Mimir's consciousness, trapped in eternal suffering but still capable of observation and analysis, watched this decay with the satisfaction of someone seeing a long-term plan reach its inevitable conclusion. Every aspect of Asgard's decline had been anticipated and encouraged through decades of careful manipulation. The divine society that was falling apart around Odin's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control was not failing accidentally, but being systematically destroyed by the consequences of choices that the smartest man alive had helped engineer. The death spiral had begun in earnest, accelerating beyond any possibility of recovery or reversal. The cosmic forces that Mimir served were no longer subtle influences operating in the background of events, but obvious factors shaping every development in ways that even Odin could recognize. The twilight of the gods was approaching, and its architect remained conscious and alert, ready to witness the fulfillment of the purpose that had justified every sacrifice he had made in its service. The arrival of Kratos in Midgard marked the beginning of the end for everything Odin had built, though the All-Father remained blind to the true significance of this development for far longer than his legendary wisdom should have allowed. The ghost of Sparta came not as a conquering hero or divine liberator, but as a broken god, seeking nothing more than peaceful obscurity in a realm far from the memories that haunted him. Yet the very forces that Mimir had spent centuries putting into motion would ensure that this desire for peace became impossible to fulfill. Mimir's first awareness of Kratos came not through direct observation, but through the subtle vibrations that rippled through the cosmic order when a god-killer of such magnitude entered the 9 realms. His consciousness, trapped within the severed head that hung from Yggdrasil's branches, remained connected to the mystical currents that flowed between worlds. The arrival of someone capable of ending divine life created disturbances in these currents that were unmistakable to anyone sensitive enough to detect them. The initial encounters between Kratos and the Norse pantheon were precisely the kind of escalating conflicts that Mimir had engineered his entire conspiracy to encourage. Each violent confrontation served to demonstrate that the Æsir had become so corrupted that even their responses to legitimate threats were characterized by excessive brutality and paranoid overreaction. The cycle of violence that began with Baldr's obsessive pursuit of the ghost of Sparta would eventually consume the entire divine order. Baldr's curse, which prevented him from feeling anything while rendering him effectively invulnerable, represented the perfect symbol of what Æsir civilization had become under Odin's rule. The god who should have embodied light and wisdom had been transformed into something that was technically immortal but existentially dead, capable of surviving any attack, but incapable of experiencing the joy that made survival worthwhile. His desperate attempts to break Frigg's protective spell through provoking Kratos into killing him revealed the depth of spiritual sickness that had infected even the most noble members of the Pantheon. The relationship that developed between Kratos and Atreus provided Mimir with his first real hope for genuine renewal rather than mere destruction. The young god's mixed heritage, combining giant wisdom with Æsir power, made him a bridge between the world that was dying and the world that might be born from its ashes. More importantly, his father's influence was gradually teaching him to value restraint and wisdom over the raw exercise of power that had characterized divine behavior for too long. Mimir's liberation from his torment came through means that even his vast foresight had not anticipated in detail, though the general shape of events had been planned for centuries. Kratos's pragmatic approach to problem-solving, combined with his willingness to take actions that other gods would consider morally questionable, made him the perfect instrument for freeing someone whose knowledge was desperately needed, but whose release would inevitably anger powerful enemies. The moment when Kratos severed the mystical bonds that held Mimir's head to Yggdrasil represented more than simple rescue from physical torment. It marked the beginning of the final phase of the cosmic plan that the smartest man alive had been implementing since before the rise of Asgard itself. The knowledge and wisdom that Odin had tried to monopolize through torture was now available to guide the forces that would bring about necessary change. The irony of Mimir's new role as advisor to the ghost of Sparta was not lost on him. For centuries, he had served as counselor to the very god whose destruction he was secretly orchestrating. Now he would serve as guide to the being whose arrival marked the beginning of that destruction. But this time his counsel would be honest rather than manipulative, designed to minimize suffering rather than maximize cosmic justice through catastrophic punishment. The intelligence that Mimir provided about Æsir capabilities and vulnerabilities proved invaluable for Kratos' survival and success, but more importantly, it allowed the ghost of Sparta to make informed decisions about when violence was necessary and when alternative solutions might be possible. The god-killer, who had once destroyed an entire pantheon through unrestrained rage, was gradually learning to apply his power with surgical precision rather than indiscriminate devastation. The growing alliance between Kratos, Atreus, and Mimir represented something unprecedented in the history of divine politics. Here was a partnership based on mutual respect and shared objectives, rather than fear, manipulation, or calculated advantage. The bonds that developed between them were genuine rather than tactical, creating a foundation for the kind of governance that might actually serve the needs of those being governed, rather than simply maintaining the power of those doing the governing. Odin's mounting desperation, as his carefully constructed order began to collapse around him, drove the All-Father to increasingly reckless decisions that played directly into Mimir's long-term strategy. The same paranoid intelligence that had allowed him to discover his advisor's betrayal now became a liability that prevented him from recognizing genuine opportunities for compromise or strategic retreat. Every threat was met with overwhelming force, every challenge with disproportionate response, every setback with escalated commitment to failed policies. The revelation of Atreus's true nature as Loki created complications that even Mimir had not fully anticipated, though the general pattern of father-son conflict had been written into the cosmic order from the beginning. The young god struggled to reconcile his loyalty to Kratos with his growing understanding of his prophetic role in Ragnarok, created exactly the kind of internal tension that would eventually force him to choose between personal comfort and cosmic responsibility. The manipulation of Atreus by Odin during this period represented the All-Father's most sophisticated attempt to turn the tables on his enemies by corrupting their greatest asset from within. The techniques employed were variations on the same methods that Mimir had used against Odin himself, creating false trust through apparent shared interests while gradually introducing ideas and objectives that served the manipulator's true agenda. Yet Odin's efforts were doomed to failure because they were based on the same fundamental misunderstanding of human nature that had made him vulnerable to Mimir's manipulation in the first place. The All-Father assumed that everyone was ultimately motivated by self-interest and could therefore be corrupted through appeals to personal advantage. He failed to recognize that both Kratos and Atreus had been shaped by experiences that made them capable of genuine sacrifice for principles larger than themselves. The final confrontation between Odin and the forces arrayed against him was not the epic battle between equals that the All-Father had probably imagined, but rather the inevitable collapse of a structure that had been systematically weakened from within for centuries. Every alliance that abandoned him, every strategy that failed, every weapon that proved inadequate, had been compromised long before the fighting began by the patient work of someone he had trusted completely. The role played by Mimir during these climactic events was necessarily limited by his physical constraints, but his influence was felt in every aspect of the conflict through the knowledge he had preserved and the plans he had made. The intelligence networks he had built continued to provide crucial information at exactly the right moments. The hidden caches of weapons and resources he had established allowed Odin's enemies to maintain their resistance longer than should have been possible. Most importantly, the moral framework he had helped establish ensured that victory would lead to renewal rather than mere revenge. The death of Odin at the hands of those he had oppressed was not the climax of Mimir's story, but rather its resolution. The cosmic justice that had demanded the All-Father's destruction was finally satisfied, clearing the way for the kind of governance that actually served the needs of those being governed. The smartest man alive had achieved his ultimate objective through methods that required him to sacrifice everything he valued personally, in service of principles that transcended individual comfort or advantage. The immediate aftermath of Odin's defeat was characterized by the careful dismantling of the totalitarian structures he had built rather than their wholesale destruction. Mimir's guidance proved invaluable for distinguishing between institutions that were fundamentally corrupt and those that had simply been misused by corrupt leadership. The goal was transformation rather than obliteration, renewal rather than simple ending. The liberation of the various realms from Æsir domination proceeded according to principles that Mimir had spent centuries developing through his study of political philosophy and his observation of successful resistance movements. Local autonomy was restored gradually, with support structures in place to prevent the chaos that might otherwise have followed the sudden removal of centralized authority. The transition from empire to federation was managed with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of his long-term planning. The release of Loki from his torment beneath the serpent marked another crucial step in the process of cosmic renewal. The trickster god's rage, carefully cultivated through centuries of suffering, was channeled toward constructive purposes rather than simple revenge. His unique combination of intelligence, creativity, and understanding of divine psychology made him an invaluable ally in the work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. The integration of surviving giants into the new cosmic order represented perhaps the most significant challenge of the post-Odin era. The trauma inflicted upon their people through systematic genocide could not be easily forgotten or forgiven, yet their wisdom and knowledge were essential for establishing the kind of balanced governance that would prevent future cycles of oppression and rebellion. Mimir's role as mediator between former enemies proved crucial for achieving reconciliation without sacrificing justice. The transformation of Asgard itself, from imperial capital to center of cooperative governance, required extensive modification of both its physical infrastructure and its cultural institutions. The surveillance systems that had maintained totalitarian control were dismantled and replaced with communication networks that facilitated genuine consultation and collaboration. The military installations that had projected force throughout the 9 realms were converted to research facilities and diplomatic centers that projected knowledge and understanding instead. The preservation of valuable aspects of Æsir culture, while eliminating its oppressive elements, required the kind of sophisticated analysis that only someone with Mimir's comprehensive understanding of divine history could provide. Traditional festivals were maintained but modified to celebrate cooperation rather than conquest. Epic literature was preserved but reinterpreted to emphasize the tragic consequences of unchecked ambition rather than glorifying it. Even architectural symbols were carefully evaluated to determine which could be retained as historical reminders and which needed to be removed as sources of painful association. The establishment of new forms of governance that incorporated representatives from all the realms created unprecedented opportunities for peaceful conflict resolution and collaborative problem-solving. The federal structure that emerged was based on principles that Mimir had been developing since his earliest observations of successful inter-realm cooperation. Power was distributed rather than concentrated, decisions were made through consultation rather than decree, and accountability was built into every level of the system. Yet even as he guided this process of renewal and reconstruction, Mimir understood that his role as advisor and counselor would necessarily be temporary. The new order he was helping to build needed to develop its own sources of wisdom and leadership, free from dependence on someone whose very existence was a reminder of the old system's failures. The smartest man alive would eventually need to step back from active involvement in governance, allowing others to take responsibility for maintaining what he had helped them create. The silence that followed Odin's death was more profound in the absence of sound. It was the silence of a cosmic order reassessing itself, of natural forces recalibrating, after centuries of artificial distortion, of existence itself exhaling after holding its breath through an era of divine oppression that had threatened the very foundations of universal justice. Mimir experienced this silence not as emptiness but as potential, the pregnant pause before creation begins anew. Freedom, after centuries of torment, came as a shock that was almost more difficult to process than the suffering it replaced. The absence of constant pain created a void in Mimir's consciousness that had to be deliberately filled with new purposes and objectives. The smartest man alive found himself confronting an unexpected challenge, adapting to liberation when his entire existence had been defined by resistance to oppression and service to a cause that had now achieved its ultimate victory. The relationship with Kratos evolved from pragmatic alliance to genuine friendship during the immediate aftermath of Ragnarok. Though both beings remained too emotionally scarred by their respective histories to openly acknowledge the depth of their mutual respect and affection. The ghost of Sparta had learned to value wisdom over strength, while the ancient advisor had rediscovered the possibility of serving power that was actually worthy of service. Atreus's role as bridge between the old world and the new became increasingly important as the scope of necessary reconstruction became apparent. His youth provided optimism and energy that balanced the world weariness of his elders, while his mixed heritage gave him credibility with factions that might otherwise have remained suspicious of any attempt at unified governance. The boy who had begun the journey as Kratos' son had evolved into Loki the Mediator, a trickster whose tricks served harmony rather than chaos. The immediate practical challenges of governing the 9 realms without the infrastructure of Asir control proved more complex than even Mimir's extensive planning had anticipated. Centuries of imperial administration had created dependencies that could not be severed overnight without causing humanitarian disasters across multiple worlds. The transition from tyranny to freedom required careful management to prevent the chaos that would undermine everything they had fought to achieve. The liberation of political prisoners from Asgard's dungeons revealed the true scope of Odin's paranoia and the extent to which dissent had been suppressed through fear rather than addressed through policy reform. Gods, giants, and beings from throughout the realms had been imprisoned for crimes as minor as questioning official policies or as thought-based as possessing knowledge that the All-Father considered dangerous. Each release required careful evaluation to determine what support would be needed for successful reintegration into society. The economic disruption caused by the collapse of Asgard's tribute system created immediate shortages of essential resources across multiple realms, forcing the new leadership to develop alternative distribution networks almost overnight. Mimir's knowledge of pre-imperial trade relationships proved invaluable for re-establishing commercial connections that had been severed by centuries of forced dependence on Æsir-controlled supply chains. The dismantling of Odin's surveillance apparatus required delicate handling to preserve legitimate security capabilities, while eliminating the oppressive monitoring that had made normal social relationships impossible throughout the realms. Mimir worked with former victims of the system to identify which intelligence-gathering activities served genuine protective purposes and which existed solely to maintain political control through intimidation. The cultural healing process began with the restoration of traditional practices and beliefs that had been suppressed or distorted under Asir rule. Festivals that had been modified to glorify imperial conquest were returned to their original forms, celebrating seasonal cycles and community bonds. Languages that had been discouraged in favor of Asir standardization were revived and taught to new generations. Art forms that had been forced to serve propaganda purposes were liberated to explore themes of genuine human concern. The challenge of justice for crimes committed during the imperial period required Solomon-like wisdom to balance accountability with the need for social reconciliation. Many beings who had participated in Odin's oppression had done so under duress or in ignorance of the full scope of what they were supporting. Distinguishing between those who deserved punishment and those who merited clemency required detailed knowledge of individual circumstances that only someone with Mimir's comprehensive understanding of the period could provide. The reintegration of surviving giant communities into the broader cosmic order proved particularly challenging due to the trauma inflicted upon their people through systematic genocide. The few who had escaped Odin's extermination campaign carried psychological wounds that made trust extremely difficult to establish or maintain. Mimir's role as advocate and interpreter became crucial for facilitating communication between giant survivors and other groups who genuinely wanted to make amends for past injuries. The establishment of new governmental structures that could accommodate the needs and perspectives of all the realms required innovations in political theory that drew upon the best aspects of various traditional systems while avoiding the concentration of power that had made Asir tyranny possible. The federal model that emerged distributed authority across multiple levels and institutions, creating checks and balances that would prevent any single individual or group from accumulating dangerous levels of control. The magical and technological innovations that had been developed under Odin's rule presented complex decisions about which advances should be preserved and which should be abandoned due to their association with oppressive practices. Weapon systems designed for genocide were obviously eliminated, but other technologies that could serve beneficial purposes if properly regulated required careful evaluation to determine appropriate uses and safeguards. The transformation of Asgard, from imperial capital to cooperative center, required extensive physical reconstruction to remove symbols of domination while preserving architectural achievements that represented genuine cultural value. The throne room, where Odin had issued decrees that shaped the fate of entire realms, was converted into a council chamber where representatives from all the worlds could meet as equals to discuss matters of mutual concern. The educational reforms implemented throughout the realms aimed to replace imperial propaganda with curricula that encouraged critical thinking and cultural appreciation. The history that had been distorted to justify Æsir's supremacy was corrected to acknowledge the contributions and perspectives of all peoples. The literature that had glorified conquest was balanced with works that explored the costs of violence and the benefits of cooperation. The psychological healing required for societies that had lived under totalitarian control for centuries proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the reconstruction process. Generations had grown up believing that surveillance and suspicion were normal aspects of social interaction. Learning to trust again, to speak freely without fear of consequences, to form genuine relationships rather than strategic alliances, required time and patient encouragement from those who remembered what healthy communities looked like. The role of prophecy and fate in the new cosmic order became a subject of intense philosophical debate as thinkers grappled with the implications of having witnessed the fulfillment of ancient predictions about divine destruction and renewal. Some argued that the success of the Ragnarok prophecies proved that fate was inescapable and that free will was largely illusory. Others contended that the prophecies had been fulfilled through conscious choices made by individuals who understood their cosmic significance. Mimir's perspective on this debate was shaped by his unique position as someone who had both served fate and shaped it through deliberate action. He understood that prophecy was not a simple prediction of inevitable events, but rather a description of the consequences that would follow if certain patterns of behavior continued unchanged. The future could be altered through conscious choice, but only by those who understood the cosmic principles that governed cause and effect on a universal scale. The establishment of new institutions for preserving and transmitting knowledge represented one of the most important legacies of the post-Ragnarok period. The libraries that were built in multiple realms were designed to serve all peoples rather than hoarding information for the benefit of ruling elites. The schools that were founded emphasized cooperation and understanding rather than competition and domination. The research centers that were established focused on improving life for all beings rather than developing new methods of control or conquest. The healing of the natural environment from the damage caused by divine warfare required extensive magical intervention and careful stewardship of resources that had been depleted through centuries of imperial exploitation. Realms that had been strip-mined for tribute were gradually restored to ecological balance. Waterways that had been polluted by magical experiments were purified through techniques that combined traditional knowledge with innovative applications of beneficial sorcery. The development of new forms of international law that could govern relationships between sovereign realms while respecting their individual sovereignty required diplomatic innovations that drew upon the wisdom of many cultures and traditions. The treaties that were negotiated established frameworks for peaceful conflict resolution that made warfare unnecessary, except in cases of genuine self-defense against aggression. The personal transformation that Mimir underwent during this period was as significant as the political and social changes happening around him. The being who had spent centuries serving a cosmic purpose larger than himself gradually learned to value personal relationships and individual happiness as worthwhile objectives in their own right. The smartest man alive discovered that wisdom could be expressed through friendship and humor as well as through grand strategic planning and philosophical discourse. The legacy of Odin's rule could not be entirely erased, nor should it be, according to Mimir's understanding of historical justice. The memory of what could happen when power was concentrated without accountability served as a valuable warning to future generations who might be tempted to sacrifice freedom for security or diversity for unity. The monuments to imperial achievement were preserved alongside memorials to its victims, creating a complex historical record that acknowledged both accomplishment and atrocity. The emergence of new leaders who had not been shaped by the imperial period provided hope for continued progress toward more just and sustainable forms of governance. These younger gods and mortals brought fresh perspectives unburdened by the compromises and rationalizations that had been necessary for survival under totalitarian rule. Their idealism was tempered by the wisdom of their elders, but not constrained by the limitations that experience with oppression might otherwise have imposed. The ongoing work of reconstruction and renewal would require generations to complete, but the foundations had been laid for societies that could serve the needs and respect the dignity of all their members. The cosmic order that emerged from the ashes of Assyrian imperialism was not perfect, but it was genuinely committed to the principles of justice, compassion, and wisdom that Mimir had served throughout his long struggle against divine corruption. The ripple effects of Mimir's betrayal and the subsequent fall of Asgard spread far beyond the 9 realms, reaching into distant pantheons and cosmic orders that had previously considered themselves safely isolated from Norse political upheavals. The news that a divine empire built on conquest and oppression had been brought down through a combination of internal resistance and external intervention sent shockwaves through ruling classes throughout the universe, forcing gods everywhere to reconsider the sustainability of their own methods of governance. The Egyptian Pantheon, with its own complex history of divine politics and power struggles, found itself confronting uncomfortable parallels between Odin's trajectory and certain aspects of their own traditional practices. The systematic suppression of dissent that had characterized late-period Æsir rule bore disturbing similarities to methods employed during some of the darker chapters of Egyptian divine history. Reform movements gained momentum as younger gods pointed to Asgard's fate as evidence of what could happen to pantheons that ignored the legitimate grievances of their subjects. The Celtic gods, whose more anarchic approach to divine governance had often been criticized as inefficient and chaotic, suddenly found their decentralized methods being praised as examples of sustainable political organization. The absence of concentrated authority that had once been seen as a weakness was now recognized as a safeguard against the kind of tyrannical excess that had doomed the Sur. Diplomatic delegations arrived seeking to study Celtic governmental structures as potential models for reformed divine administration. The philosophical implications of Mimir's story resonated throughout academic and religious institutions across multiple dimensions of existence. The concept that genuine wisdom sometimes required betraying apparent loyalty challenged fundamental assumptions about virtue and duty that had guided moral thinking for millennia. Scholars grappled with the paradox of someone achieving the highest form of service through acts that appeared to be the basest form of treachery. The theological debates that emerged from these philosophical challenges were particularly intense within religious systems that emphasized absolute obedience to divine authority. If the smartest being in existence had concluded that resistance to corrupt power was a moral imperative, what did that suggest about the obligations of mortals living under questionable governance? The implications for established religious hierarchies were profound and troubling. The impact on prophetic traditions throughout the cosmos was equally significant. Mimir's successful manipulation of fate through conscious choice rather than passive acceptance challenged deterministic interpretations of prophecy, while validating more complex understandings of the relationship between prediction and free will. Seers and oracles found themselves re-examining ancient visions to distinguish between warnings that required action and inevitabilities that demanded acceptance. The educational reforms inspired by Mimir's example spread throughout civilizations that recognized the connection between ignorance and oppression. The hoarding of knowledge by ruling elites was increasingly seen as a form of theft from the common good, leading to the establishment of public institutions dedicated to making wisdom accessible to all members of society, regardless of their social status or political connections. The influence on resistance movements was immediate and dramatic. Groups struggling against oppressive regimes throughout the universe found in Mimir's story a template for long-term strategic thinking that could achieve fundamental change through patience, intelligence, and moral clarity, rather than simply through violent rebellion. The techniques he had developed for undermining corrupt authority from within became subjects of intense study and adaptation. The transformation of intelligence work from a tool of oppression into an instrument of liberation required rethinking basic assumptions about the purposes and methods of information gathering. The networks that Mimir had built demonstrated that surveillance and infiltration could serve justice rather than tyranny if they were guided by principles that prioritized the welfare of the monitored populations over the convenience of their monitors. The implications for divine psychology became apparent as gods throughout the cosmos confronted the possibility that their own advisors might be working against them. The paranoia that had consumed Odin during his final years began manifesting in other pantheons as rulers questioned the loyalty of beings they had previously trusted without reservation. This suspicion, while often unjustified, sometimes led to the discovery of genuine corruption that needed to be addressed. The cultural impact was perhaps most visible in the arts, where Mimir's story inspired new forms of expression that explored themes of moral complexity and the sometimes contradictory demands of conscience and duty. Epic poems, dramatic performances, and visual artworks throughout the cosmos grappled with questions about when betrayal became virtue and when loyalty became complicity in evil. The economic consequences of Asgard's fall reverberated through trade networks that had depended on the stability provided by imperial enforcement of commercial agreements. Alternative systems of international commerce had to be developed that could function without the threat of overwhelming retaliation against those who violated their obligations. The models that emerged were generally more equitable and sustainable than what they replaced. The technological innovations that had been suppressed under Æsir rule because they might threaten imperial control were gradually released and developed for beneficial purposes. Communication systems that had been designed for surveillance were adapted for education and entertainment. Transportation networks that had been built for military conquest were converted to serve commercial and cultural exchange. The impact on family relationships throughout the cosmos was profound, as parents grappled with the implications of Mimir's example for raising children who might someday face similar moral choices. Traditional teachings about obedience to authority were balanced with new emphasis on the importance of independent moral judgment and the courage to act on ethical convictions, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. The influence on legal systems was equally significant as courts throughout the universe confronted questions about the circumstances under which illegal acts might be morally justified. The concept of cosmic justice superseding local law created new categories of legal reasoning that acknowledged the possibility of legitimate resistance to unjust authority while maintaining respect for the rule of law in general. The rehabilitation of the concept of necessary evil challenged religious and philosophical traditions that had previously insisted on absolute moral categories. Mimir's story demonstrated that sometimes the prevention of greater suffering required accepting responsibility for lesser harms, creating complex ethical frameworks that acknowledged the tragic nature of existence while maintaining commitment to the ultimate triumph of good over evil. The preservation of Mimir's techniques and philosophies for future generations became a priority for institutions dedicated to preventing the recurrence of the kind of divine tyranny that had necessitated his intervention. Archives were established to maintain detailed records of the methods he had employed, not as instructions for replication, but as warnings about the circumstances that might make such methods necessary again. The ongoing influence of his example on subsequent generations of leaders was evident in the emergence of governance styles that prioritized transparency, accountability, and service over power, prestige, and personal advantage. The idea that true authority came from earning trust rather than demanding obedience gradually replaced older models based on inherited privilege or acquired dominance. The transformation of Asgard itself into a center of learning and cooperation rather than conquest and control served as a living monument to the possibility of fundamental change in even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Visitors from throughout the cosmos came to study the methods by which a totalitarian empire had been converted into a federal democracy without descending into chaos or revenge-based violence. The personal relationships that Mimir continued to maintain with Kratos, Atreus, and other key figures in the reconstruction provided ongoing opportunities for refining and developing the principles that would guide future governance. These friendships were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice, rather than calculation or manipulation, demonstrating the possibility of healthy relationships between beings of vastly different backgrounds and capabilities. The establishment of memorials honoring both the victims of Æsir oppression and the agents of its overthrow created spaces for reflection and education that would serve future generations as reminders of the costs of unchecked power and the importance of moral courage in confronting injustice. These monuments were designed to inspire rather than simply commemorate, encouraging visitors to consider their own responsibilities in maintaining just societies. The integration of Mimir's wisdom into the educational curricula of institutions throughout the cosmos ensured that his insights about power, justice, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects would continue to influence thinking long after the immediate circumstances that had required his intervention were forgotten. The smartest man alive had achieved a form of immortality through ideas rather than physical preservation. The development of new diplomatic protocols that incorporated lessons learned from the Æsir period created frameworks for international relations that were more likely to prevent conflicts while providing peaceful mechanisms for resolving disputes when they inevitably arose. The emphasis on mutual respect and shared benefit rather than dominance and exploitation gradually transformed the character of inter-realm politics. The ongoing evolution of the cosmic order, in response to the changes initiated by Mimir's actions, demonstrated that transformation was an ongoing process rather than a single event. The principles he had championed required constant vigilance and commitment from each new generation to maintain their relevance and effectiveness in addressing emerging challenges and opportunities. The legacy of the smartest man alive was not a fixed doctrine or unchanging system, but a living tradition of wisdom, courage, and commitment to justice that continued to grow and adapt as circumstances required. His greatest achievement was not the destruction of a particular form of tyranny, but the demonstration that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overcome through intelligence, patience, and unwavering dedication to principles larger than personal comfort or safety. The question that haunts scholars across the cosmos in the aftermath of these events is not whether Mimir's actions were justified, but whether his methods could or should be replicated if similar circumstances arose again. The smartest man alive had achieved his objectives through means that required extraordinary personal sacrifice and moral compromise, raising profound questions about the price of justice and the responsibilities of those who possess the knowledge and capability to challenge corrupt power. Modern discoveries about the true scope of Mimir's network continue to reshape our understanding of how deeply his influence penetrated into every aspect of divine governance during the Æsir period. Archaeological expeditions throughout the 9 realms regularly uncover hidden caches of documents, artifacts, and communication devices that reveal previously unknown aspects of his conspiracy. Each new finding adds layers of complexity to what was already recognized as the most sophisticated intelligence operation in cosmic history. The revelation that Mimir's influence extended far beyond the Norse realms has prompted investigations into other pantheons and divine hierarchies where similar patterns of manipulation might have occurred. The techniques he developed for identifying and exploiting the moral weaknesses of corrupt rulers appear to have been studied and adapted by resistance movements throughout the universe, raising questions about whether other seemingly stable divine orders might harbor similar vulnerabilities. The ongoing mystery of what became of certain key figures from Mimir's network continues to fuel speculation and investigation across multiple realms. Several of his most important agents simply vanished during the transition period, following Odin's defeat, leaving behind only cryptic messages suggesting that their work was not yet complete. The possibility that these individuals might be operating in other cosmic domains, perhaps laying groundwork for interventions against divine tyrannies that have not yet been identified, represents one of the most intriguing aspects of his continuing legacy. The prophetic elements of Mimir's story raise disturbing questions about the nature of fate and free will that have profound implications for how beings throughout the cosmos understand their own agency and responsibility. If the smartest man alive was fulfilling cosmic necessity rather than making independent choices, what does that suggest about the moral status of his actions and the decisions made by those who opposed or supported him? The technological innovations that emerged from Mimir's research programs continue to yield new applications and capabilities decades after their initial development. Communication systems that he designed for coordinating resistance activities have been adapted for educational and diplomatic purposes that their creator never anticipated. The weapons he helped develop for bringing down divine tyrannies have been converted into tools for construction and environmental restoration that serve entirely peaceful objectives. The influence of his example on subsequent generations of leaders and advisors has created new traditions of governance that prioritize transparency, accountability, and service to the common good over personal advancement or institutional loyalty. Yet these same traditions have also produced leaders who struggle with the moral complexities that Mimir navigated, sometimes paralyzed by awareness of potential unintended consequences rather than empowered by commitment to clear principles. The question of whether similar interventions might be necessary in the future haunts those who have studied his methods and understand the circumstances that made them necessary. The patterns of corruption and moral decay that characterized late-period Æsir rule can be observed in other divine hierarchies and political systems, raising the possibility that new forms of resistance and intervention might eventually be required to prevent the recurrence of such systematic oppression. The mysteries surrounding Mimir's current activities and objectives continue to generate speculation and concern among those who understand the scope of his capabilities. While he appears to have embraced a more conventional role as advisor and friend to Kratos and Atreus, his vast intelligence networks remain partially intact, and his understanding of cosmic principles continues to evolve. The possibility that he might be preparing for challenges that others have not yet recognized cannot be entirely dismissed. The impact of his story on religious and philosophical traditions throughout the cosmos has created new schools of thought that grapple with questions about the relationship between loyalty and justice, obedience and conscience, service and sacrifice. These intellectual movements have produced insights that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of Norse mythology, offering frameworks for understanding moral choice and political responsibility that apply to any society struggling with questions of authority and resistance. The preservation and transmission of the knowledge that Mimir accumulated during his centuries of service and opposition has become a priority for institutions dedicated to preventing the recurrence of divine tyranny. Yet the sheer scope of what he learned about manipulation, conspiracy, and systematic subversion raises troubling questions about whether such knowledge can be safely preserved without creating new opportunities for abuse by those who might use it for less noble purposes. The transformation of Asgard and the broader Nine Realms continues to reveal new aspects of the damage that was caused by centuries of imperial rule, and the complexity of the healing process that is still underway. Environmental restoration projects regularly uncover evidence of systematic ecological destruction that was hidden or minimized during the Æsir period. Social reconstruction efforts continue to identify populations that were marginalized or oppressed in ways that were not previously understood. The emergence of new forms of inter-realm cooperation and communication has created opportunities for collaboration and cultural exchange that would have been impossible under the old imperial system. Yet these same developments have also revealed the existence of other cosmic hierarchies and power structures that may pose challenges requiring responses that have not yet been developed. The universe revealed by the fall of Æsir imperialism is larger and more complex than many had previously understood. The personal evolution of Mimir himself continues to fascinate those who study leadership, wisdom, and moral development. The being who sacrificed everything for cosmic justice has gradually learned to value personal relationships and individual happiness as worthwhile objectives in their own right. His friendship with Kratos and his mentoring relationship with Atreus have demonstrated capabilities for growth and change that suggest even the most ancient beings retain the potential for transformation. The question of succession and continuity represents one of the most significant challenges facing those who have benefited from Mimir's guidance and sacrifice. The knowledge and wisdom that he embodies cannot simply be transferred to others, yet the principles he represents must somehow be maintained and adapted by future generations who will face challenges he cannot anticipate. The development of institutions and traditions that can preserve and apply his insights without becoming dependent on his personal involvement remains an ongoing project. The broader implications of his story, for understanding the nature of heroism and moral courage, continue to influence how societies throughout the cosmos approach questions of resistance, leadership, and social change. The model he provides of someone who achieved the greatest good through methods that required tremendous personal cost has inspired movements for justice and reform that extend far beyond the immediate sphere of Norse influence. The mysteries that remain unsolved about his motivations, methods, and continuing objectives serve as reminders that even the most thoroughly studied historical figures retain aspects that cannot be fully understood or explained. The smartest man alive may have revealed the scope of his conspiracy and the nature of his cosmic purpose, but the deepest questions about what drives someone to undertake such extraordinary sacrifice for principles larger than personal comfort or advantage remain as mysterious as ever. The ongoing relevance of his example for contemporary challenges suggests that the lessons of his story are not merely historical curiosities, but practical guidance for anyone who must navigate the complex relationships between power, justice, wisdom, and courage in their own circumstances. The specific methods he employed were shaped by the unique conditions of his time and place, but the principles that guided his choices have universal application for those who seek to serve justice rather than merely accumulate power. The final mystery may be whether the cosmic forces that Mimir served so faithfully have additional work for him to accomplish, or whether his great task has been completed with the fall of Æsir tyranny and the establishment of more just forms of governance throughout the Nine Realms. The possibility that his story represents not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter in a larger narrative of cosmic transformation and renewal, remains one of the most intriguing questions for those who seek to understand the true scope of his legacy. The smartest man alive achieved something that many had thought impossible, proving that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overcome through intelligence, patience, and unwavering commitment to principles larger than personal safety or comfort. His story continues to inspire and challenge all who encounter it. serving as a reminder that wisdom without courage is merely academic exercise, while courage without wisdom is merely noble failure. The combination of both, guided by genuine commitment to justice and tempered by understanding of the true costs of necessary action, remains the standard by which all claims to moral leadership must ultimately be measured. The betrayed became the betrayer. The tortured became the teacher. The condemned became the liberator. In the end, Mimir's greatest victory was not the destruction of divine tyranny, but the demonstration that such destruction was possible, that no system of oppression, however ancient or powerful, could withstand the sustained application of wisdom, guided by justice and powered by the kind of courage that accepts any personal cost in service of universal principles that transcend individual comfort or advantage.